The gate leaf was lowering, and it was less than a meter away from the slot. Dalen Wurst stood outside. The fourth wave was already moving along the entire length of the northern breakwater, and there were 9 seconds left until the first creatures reached it. He looked through the gap beneath the gate leaf. Behind it stood his own people. Hygar Crane kept his hand on the lever and wouldn't let go. Tobish Land had turned away toward the wall. Garn Old stared straight ahead without blinking. Ilsa Merv stood closest to the gap and held his bag in her hands. Inside the bag lay 31 grains. Everything he'd collected over 412 days. She herself had sent him to the outer perimeter 40 minutes ago. She'd said the sensor in the third sector was lying, and that only he could check it. The sensor wasn't lying. She was. Dalen managed to say only one word. He called Hygar by name. Hygar didn't answer him. Hygar told the others that they had to hold the perimeter and that they wouldn't give up 30 men for one. The gate slid into place. Dalen was left outside with a knife and a half-empty magazine. He turned toward the wave. He'd taken down 9 of them on the rocks, and that was more than anyone had expected. The 10th creature grabbed him by the shoulder and pulled him down, and he heard his own collarbone snap. The last thing he saw was a crack beneath the gate and the light of a lantern shining through it. The light didn't move. Someone was standing there, watching until the very end. Then it went dark. Then it grew light again. Dalen opened his eyes and saw the ceiling. The ceiling was white, and there was a stain on it from an old leak. The stain was shaped like a horseshoe. He knew that stain. He'd looked at it every morning for 8 years straight in the apartment on Lower Pier. That apartment hadn't existed for 400 days. It had been burned down along with the entire neighborhood during the second week. Dalen didn't move. He lay there and listened. A streetcar was passing below. The streetcars had stopped running on the very first day. A seagull was screeching outside the window. The seagulls had disappeared 3 days before the first whistle. He raised his right hand and looked at it. His hand was intact. There wasn't a single scar on it, not a trace of the winch, not a trace of teeth. He sat up in bed and let his feet dangle onto the cold floor. The phone lay face down on a stool. He flipped it over. The date was displayed on the screen. Dalen read it 3 times. There were 7 days left until 4:11 a.m. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He sat there for a minute with the phone in his hand and felt his left knee trembling. Then he pressed his palm against his knee and held it there until it calmed down. Then he stood up, went into the bathroom, and turned on the light. In the mirror stood a man 8 years younger than the one he remembered. The face was unfamiliar, too smooth, too calm. He raised his left forearm and turned it toward the light. Where his elbow should have been, there was a thin gray line. It began below the crease and ran down toward his wrist. It was as smooth as a pencil mark. He pressed his finger against it. Something responded beneath the skin. Not pain, a pull. As if there were an empty shelf inside his arm, and the shelf was waiting. Dalen knew that pull. That was exactly how the body reacted when a grain of seed was placed in an open wound. He stood there and stared at the line for a long time. So it wasn't just his memory that had returned. His capacity had returned as well. The 31st slot was empty and waiting. He pulled his sleeve down. He went into the kitchen, poured himself some water, and drank it all. Then he took a sheet of paper from the drawer and a pencil and began to write. He wasn't writing a plan. He was writing dates. The first whistle will open in dry dock number 3 in 7 days at 4:11 a.m. At 8:20 that same day, the entire city grid will go down, and with it, all the world's grids will go down. In 19 days, the shepherd will land on the water tower and take half the city's living population away. He kept writing. He wrote down where the generators would be located and which pharmacy warehouses would still have anticonvulsants by the third day. He wrote down peer numbers, birth numbers, and people's last names. By the time he finished, the sheet was black with pencil marks. Dalen looked at him and realized something simple. There was more in his head than this entire city was worth. And he had 7 days to turn that knowledge into steel. He got dressed. He took the keys from the shelf. At the door, he paused and looked around the apartment. 8 years. He felt nothing. He walked out and didn't lock the door. It was bright and warm outside, and people were standing at the bus stop with coffee. A woman was scolding a child for his dirty boots. 2 guys were arguing about a game. They were all dead. Dalen knew every number. Of Kane Hall's 300,000 residents, 11,000 had survived the first month. He walked past them and headed toward the port. By 9 o'clock, he was at the dispatch office on Lower Pier. Rhett Orris stepped out onto the porch with a cigarette, saw him, and was surprised. They'd grown up on the same staircase. Rhett asked why Dalen wasn't on his shift. Dalen said there wouldn't be any more shifts. Rhett laughed and asked if he'd been fired or had quit on his own. Dalen said he needed the schedule for dry dock number 3 for the coming week and a list of everything currently there. Rhett stopped laughing and said the dry dock was dead and that nothing had been there for 4 years except rust. Dalen said that suited him just fine. Rhett looked at him closely. He asked if everything was okay at home. He asked if Dalen was drinking. Dalen replied that he wasn't drinking. He told Rhett one thing. He said that today, at 3:40 p.m. on Pier 2, a load-bearing cable on the gantry crane would snap, and the boom would swing to the right and crush 2 empty containers. He said that no one would be under the boom at that moment simply because the crew would leave for lunch 10 minutes ahead of schedule. He told Rhett not to stop the crew from leaving early. Rhett was silent for about 5 seconds. Then he said that Dalen needed to see a doctor. Dalen nodded and said he'd be back at 4. He walked away without looking back. Next was the bank. At the bank, he picked up his statement and looked at the balance. 14,000. That was all he had. In his past life, that money had lasted 4 days. He stepped out onto the street and did the math in his head. He needed 200 times that amount, and he had 6 days. He went to the real estate agency on the corner of Razviaska and told the woman behind the counter that he was selling his apartment on Nizhny Prichal for cash, today. The woman began explaining about appraisals and timelines. Dalen named his price. It was 40% below market value. The woman fell silent and then asked why. Dalen said he didn't have time. She said that only Barlow Sven handled such deals, and that people usually didn't contact him. Dalen said he needed to get in touch today. By 4 o'clock, he was back at the dispatch office. Rhett was standing on the same porch, a cigarette in his fingers that wasn't lit. He looked at Dalen as if he were seeing him for the first time in his life. The cable snapped at 3:41 p.m. The boom swung to the right and landed on 2 empty containers, crushing them like cardboard. The crew left for lunch at 3:30 p.m. because Rhett himself had let them go. 8 men were standing in the cafeteria when they heard the crash. Rhett asked how Dalen had known. His voice didn't sound like his own. Dalen said he'd explain later. Rhett said later wouldn't work for him. Dalen looked at him and said one sentence. He said that in 7 days, this city would have no electricity, no water, and no law, and that Rhett needed to decide right now whose side he was on. Rhett didn't answer. He sat down on a step and stared at his feet. Dalen left him a slip of paper with a single line on it. The note told him where to be on the 24th at 4 in the morning. He headed to the harbor and walked along the concrete, past the cranes and warehouses, and he remembered all of this in the fire. He reached dry dock number 3 just as it was getting dark. The dry dock lay empty and long, like a slit open belly. Water glistened at the bottom. Dalen climbed down the iron ladder and stood in that very spot. Here, in 7 days, the air would crack and the first one would crawl out from there. He raised his head and looked at the concrete wall of the dry dock. And then he saw it. There were fresh markings on the wall, ordinary surveying paint, orange crosses and numbers, the kind they put up before an inspection. But between 2 crosses, someone had drawn a circle with chalk. The circle was the size of a wheel. Inside the circle stood 7 short sticks. Dalen stood there looking at them, motionless for a very long time. The chalk was fresh. It crumbled under his finger. 7 sticks, 7 days. He'd been sure that in this town, only one person knew how to count to 7 from this spot. Now, he wasn't so sure. Dalen took photos of the circle from all 4 sides and wiped it away with his palm. Then he climbed out of the dock, sat down on a mooring post, and thought for exactly 4 minutes. There were 3 possibilities. Someone had returned the same way he had. Someone knew about the whistles in advance through another source. Or it was just a kid with chalk. All 3 possibilities required time. There was no time. He stood up, went into town, and put the matter aside. By 8 o'clock the next morning, he was standing in the reception area of the city security office on Chalk Hill. Captain Yerm called received him an hour later and listened for 11 minutes. Dalen spoke calmly and didn't raise his voice. He said that on the 24th at 4:11 a.m., a breach would open in dry dock number 3 and creatures would emerge from it. He said that at 8:20 a.m., the power grid across the entire country would go down and that backup lines wouldn't help. He said the port must be closed and the people evacuated to Chalk Hill near pumping station number 9. Yerm called listened until the end and then asked who Dalen worked for. Dalen said he was a crane operator. The captain said he understood. He asked if Dalen had been treated anywhere or was taking any medication. Dalen said he wasn't taking anything. Then the captain explained to him how it looked from his perspective. He said that 4 people like this came to him every week and that he sent 2 home and 2 to the clinic on Chalk Hill, and that Dalen currently seemed to be the first type. Dalen nodded and didn't argue. He asked for only one thing. He asked that his words be recorded in the intake log with the date. The captain smiled wryly and wrote it down. Dalen watched as he wrote. He wasn't planning to save anyone with this piece of paper. He was building evidence for himself. In 8 days, this logbook would be worth more than gold because, in a city where everything had collapsed, people believed the one who warned them. At the door, Dalen stopped and said one last thing. He said that the day after tomorrow, at 7:40 p.m. on Chalk Hill at 31 Upper Street, there would be a gas explosion on the 3rd floor and that the residents needed to be evacuated starting at 7 p.m. The captain stopped smiling. He said that if this was a threat, the conversation would be different. Dalen said it wasn't a threat, but a list. He walked out. No one followed him. Beyond that was the port. Hagar Crane stood at the gate of Terminal 2 in his senior security shift uniform, checking passes. Dalen walked up and stood in front of him. He looked at that face, and in his mind there was a crack beneath the gate and the light of a lantern shining through that crack. Hagar was an ordinary man. He was a bit overweight and tired, and he had a razor burn on his chin. He wasn't a killer yet. He would become one in 412 days, and he would become one precisely because he would decide that 30 is more than 1. Dalen weighed his options right then and there. He could snap his neck on that concrete in a minute, and in an hour, he'd be a wanted man and would lose 6 days and the whole plan. And most importantly, he'd lose his pay. A dead Hygar wouldn't understand anything. Hygar had to understand. Hygar asked what he was doing there and if he had a pass. Dallin said he'd gone to the wrong gate. He turned around and walked away. His hands were sweaty. Next came the money. Dallin had been doing this for 3 days, calmly, without thinking about what it was called. On the first day, he went to 6 banks along the ring road from the interchange to Chalk Hill and took out a consumer loan for the maximum amount at each one. He knew that the interbank system updated its data once a day at midnight and that, until midnight, he was a clean customer in the system's eyes, with just 1 mortgage and a good credit history. He finished in 7 hours. 1,900,000. On the second day, he met with Barlow Sven at his office above the pawn shop on Skladskoy Row. Sven was short and neat, and he had a habit of tapping his fingernail on the table. He immediately started driving down the price and prepared to haggle for an hour. Dallin agreed to his very first figure and said he needed the money in cash by 6 o'clock that day. Sven stopped tapping his fingernail. He looked at Dallin in silence for about 10 seconds. Then he asked who Dallin owed money to and just how bad things were. Dallin said he didn't owe anyone anything. Sven said that didn't happen. He gave him the money that very evening after all, and then sat by the window watching as the guy loaded the bundles into a canvas bag and walked away. Over the course of 20 years, Sven had seen many desperate people. Desperate people haggle. This one didn't haggle. That made it worse. On the third day, Dallin went down to dry dock number 3 and walked to the far end under the rusty walkways. There, in a niche behind a peeling slab, lay a bundle in a black bag. In his past life, 2 teenagers had found that bundle on the 4th day of the disaster, and both had died because of it that same evening. Dallin took it out, but didn't open it right there. Inside the bag were 230,000 in cash, 2 sawed-off shotguns, and a box of ammunition. In total, he now had about 3 million in his possession. In his past life, he hadn't held even a tenth of that amount over the course of 412 days. He spent money even faster than he earned it. He didn't buy a single thing that would be useful in peacetime. He rented Dead Warehouse number 6 on Skladskoy Row for a year, paying the full amount in advance. 300 square meters, concrete, 2 loading ramps, 1 gate. The owner, Hesk Martin, had been trying to rent it out for 4 years without success, so he signed the papers in 20 minutes and then asked what would be stored there. Dallin said storage. Martin asked what would be stored. Dallin said everything. Then he went to get the diesel. He drove around 6 gas stations and 3 fuel depots, filling up a little at a time so as not to attract attention. 118 20-liter cans. He hauled them to the warehouse at night in a rented van and carried them in himself. Then came the grains, flour, salt, oil, and sugar. He didn't pick what tasted good. He just took whatever was available. Then water in 5-liter bottles, stacked 6 rows high up to the ceiling. Then the pharmacy. The pharmacy was the hardest part. He needed antiseptic in industrial quantities, suture material, and anticonvulsants. The anticonvulsants required a prescription. He found a way around it through a private veterinary warehouse on the outskirts, paid 3 times the price, and didn't argue. He remembered why he needed it. The granules must not be swallowed or applied to the skin. They must only be inserted into an open wound. And the body reacts to them with a convulsion that breaks the spine of half those who try it without preparation. In his past life, he'd learned this on the 15th day, when a guy named Len arched his back right before his eyes and died within 2 minutes. Dallin had planned to inject the grains into himself from the very beginning. That meant the drug was more important than food. By the evening of the 6th day, the warehouse was 2/3 full. Dallin slept on a folding cot in a nook by the gate. He no longer had an apartment. He hadn't slept for 41 hours straight, then lay down and slept for 5, waking up on his own without an alarm. Hesk Marden came to check on his warehouse that same evening because the security guard from the neighboring property had called him and told him something strange. Marden entered through the side door and stopped. He looked at the wall of water, the rows of canisters, the crates, and the man who was welding a frame for the gate in the corner at 4 in the morning. Marden had worked on this block for 30 years. He'd seen contraband, drug stashes, and warehouses full of stolen scrap metal. This was unlike any of those things. There wasn't a single item here that could be resold at a profit. There was only life in its purest form: food, water, fuel, medicine. Marden asked cautiously what Dallin was hiding from. Dallin didn't look up from his welding and said nothing. He said he was getting ready. Marden asked for what? Dallin turned off the welder, lifted his mask, and looked at him. He said that the day after tomorrow, Marden would understand everything on his own, and that if Marden wanted to stay alive, he should be here, not at home, at 4:20 a.m. on the 24th. Marden stepped outside for some fresh air, stood there for a moment, and then drove home, thinking the whole way that the guy was crazy. He thought that all night long. He thought that the next day, too. He stopped thinking that at 4:11. The problems came before the disaster. On Friday around noon, an unmarked car pulled up to the warehouse, and a man in gray got out and introduced himself as Noel Dries from the banking group's security department. He was holding a printout in his hands. 6 loans in 7 hours at 6 branches. He said that technically everything was legal, that in fact it was called something else, and that the money would have to be repaid by Monday. Dallin said that by Monday, this bank would no longer exist. Dries smiled politely and jotted something down in his notebook. He drove away. It was bad, but tolerable. The real problem came 2 hours later. A black pickup truck pulled up to the gate, and 3 men got out. One of them wore a patch with a gray square on his shoulder. Dallin arrived at Vale Sarn's office that same evening, and he came alone. The office was on the top floor of an old grain elevator, and from the window you could see the entire port all the way out to the outer roadstead. Sarn turned out to be a man in his 60s with a straight back and the hands of a dock worker. He didn't offer him a seat. He asked right away in a matter-of-fact tone. He asked who Dallin worked for. Dallin said he worked for himself. Sarn said that only fools and dead men work for themselves. He said that over the past 30 years, all kinds of cargo had passed through his hands, and that he had learned to read cargo like a book. He said that diesel fuel, water, and flour in those proportions meant one of 2 things. Either the person was planning to feed someone for a long time, or the person knew the deadline. Dallin said he knew the deadline. Sarn fell silent. He sat down on the windowsill and stared out at the harbor, remaining silent for nearly a minute. Then he said he was listening. Dallin spoke for 4 minutes. He didn't mention his own death or the breakwater. He mentioned only what could be verified. He named the date and time of the first explosion in dry dock number 3. He named the time when the net would be set up. He named one more thing. He said that tomorrow at 7:40 p.m. on Chalk Hill at 31, there would be a gas explosion on the 3rd floor, and that this had already been recorded in the city security log in his own handwriting 2 days ago, and that Sarn could verify this through any of his people at headquarters. Sarn listened and then said that if nothing exploded tomorrow, Dallin would move his warehouse out within 24 hours and leave town. Dallin agreed. As he was leaving, Sarn called out to him and asked why he'd come to talk in the first place. Dallin said he was buying time. He said he needed no one to touch his gate for the next 40 hours, and that in exchange, he'd provide the world's first reliable date. Sarn said that was very expensive information for a man who hauls canisters himself. The next day, Dallin didn't just sit around waiting. He got to work. Through Hesk Marden's office, he drew up another document. He bought the right from the city to operate pumping station number 9 on Chalk Hill for a pittance, because the station had been mothballed for 9 years and nobody wanted it. There was a key in the packet of documents. The key opened more than just the pumping station. Beneath the station lay an old civil defense shelter with a capacity of 400 people, featuring 2 exits, independent ventilation, and a meter-thick concrete wall. In his previous life, this shelter had been discovered only on the 86th day, and by that time, strangers were already inside. Dallin went down there during the day. The air was dry and smelled of lime. He walked through all 3 levels with a flashlight and noted what was broken and where. The second circuit pump was dead. The door on the lower level wouldn't close. The ventilation was working. He went back upstairs and realized he had a second location. Warehouse number 6 served as a display area. The distribution center was the real rear base. He immediately began sorting things out. Everything that could be lost was left in the warehouse. Everything he couldn't survive without was sent down the hill. In 2 nighttime trips, he transported 30 canisters, half the medicine, 1 of the 2 sawed-off shotguns, 4 boxes of canned food, and all the water in the cylinders except for 20. He did this on his own and didn't say a word to anyone about the station. During the day, he walked around his warehouse and stacked the boxes so that the wall looked full. Empty boxes in the 3rd row, sandbags under the flour. It was 2 hours' work, and it cost more than everything he had bought. At 6:40 p.m., he climbed onto the warehouse roof with his binoculars and looked toward Chalk Hill. At 7:41 p.m., Upper Street trembled. First, a window on the 3rd floor of Building 31 blew out. Then, a red tongue of fire shot out, followed by a loud bang. 2 minutes later, the sirens went off. Delenn lowered his binoculars. He didn't feel a thing. He knew the residents had been evacuated. Yerm Call didn't believe him, but he took note of it and, just in case, sent a patrol that evening to check for gas. The patrol evacuated the people onto the street 20 minutes beforehand. No one was killed. 40 minutes later, a familiar black pickup truck pulled up to the warehouse gates. The sergeant got out and silently handed Delenn the phone. It was Sarn on the line. He didn't say hello. He said his people had made a copy of the receipt log, that the entry had been made the morning before yesterday, and that the handwriting matched. He said no one would touch Delenn's gate, and that if Delenn needed anything, he should ask for it now. Delenn asked for 3 things: a welding station and 2 welders for the night, 4 200-liter barrels, and people who knew how to hold a door shut. Sarn said the first 2 items would be there in an hour. As for the third, he said he wouldn't send his own men for any price because he'd need them himself the day after tomorrow. He told Delenn to find his own people. Delenn looked for his own people that very night and found them in an unpleasant place. By 11 o'clock that evening, 3 men from Barlow Sven arrived at the warehouse. Sven had changed his mind about the apartment deal and decided that since the guy had given up 40% so easily, he could squeeze even more out of him. The oldest one was named Corvin. He was tall and spoke slowly. He said that Sven had incurred expenses for the paperwork, that the total came to 300,000, and that Delenn had better pay up today. Delenn stood in the doorway and didn't move. He said he didn't have the money. Corvin said that in that case, they'd take a look at the warehouse. Delenn said they wouldn't be looking at the warehouse. The first blow landed in his ribs. Delenn doubled over, straightened up, and stood in the doorway again. The second blow landed on his cheekbone, and he fell to one knee, then got up and stood in the doorway. He didn't respond. He didn't raise his hands. He simply got up and stood back in the same spot. Corvin struck him a 4th time, then a 5th, and stopped at the 6th. He stood there, breathing heavily, watching the man get up for the 6th time, his face battered, his back straight, and his eyes showing neither fear nor anger. Corvin had worked for Sven for 11 years, beating people regularly, and he knew all 4 reactions. People begged, people fought, people ran away, People paid. There was no fifth reaction. He asked, in a different voice now, what was actually inside. Delenn wiped the blood from his face with his sleeve and told him the truth. He said there was food, water, and fuel inside. He said that in 31 hours, everything in this city would come to an end, and that in a week, people would be killed for a single can of stew. He said that Corvin could take 300,000 in cash today, money that in a day wouldn't even be accepted in a restroom. Or he could stay here and stand on the other side of the gate tomorrow. Corvin looked at him for a long time. Then he asked how many people were needed. Delenn said 6 were needed. Corvin said he'd bring 4, and that they no longer owed Svenna anything. They spent the night welding. 2 of Sarn's men were welding a frame for the entrance out of channel iron, and Delenn worked with them as the third man. By 5 in the morning, the gate was held shut by the bumper of a passenger car. By 7, Corvin brought the 4 men. They all had criminal records. They were all hungry, and not a single one of them asked why. Delenn put them to work hauling barrels, and they hauled. By 9 in the morning, the whole port was talking about warehouse number 6 on Warehouse Row. The rumor was as twisted as all rumors. They said a crane operator from Lower Pier had gone mad after an accident on the crane and bought up half the city. They said he was a cultist waiting for the end of the world. They said he'd taken $2 million from the banks and had no intention of paying it back. They said he'd been beaten yesterday right at his own gate and hadn't fallen. Rhett Orris arrived at noon. He stood at the gate, looking at the wall of canisters, and said nothing. Then he asked about the crane. He asked how Delenn could have known about the cable 6 hours earlier. Delenn said he'd already been through this day once. Rhett said that was nonsense. Delenn said the real nonsense was waiting at home on the 24th. Rhett asked about his mother. He asked if he could bring her. Delenn said he could and named a time. Rhett left. Hesk Marden arrived at 4. Delenn looked at the circle with a single stick and went over his options again. The first circle was on the wall of the dry dock and could have been anything. The second was on his wall. There were no more coincidences. Someone was following him, marking the days, and wanted him to see it. Corvin asked if he should erase it. Delenn said no. He said to let them keep drawing. He said that the person who warns doesn't attack today. Inside, he thought otherwise. He thought that if there was a second person in the city who knew, then that knowledge was no longer his personal advantage, and that now the value was shifting from information to speed. 2 people know. Only one will make it in time. He returned to the warehouse, gathered all 9 of them by the loading ramp, and spoke for 7 minutes. He didn't try to convince anyone. He said that at 4:11 a.m., a breach would open in dry dock number 3. He said that the creatures of the first wave were short and fast, and that they were drawn to sound, but not to light. He said that at 8:20, the power and phones would go out, and that after that, no one in this city would know anything except what they saw with their own eyes. He assigned tasks. Rhett and 2 others would place barrels of water along the inner perimeter. Marden and his son would board up the windows on the 2nd level. Corwin and 3 others would take turns in pairs guarding the gate. No one goes outside without him. No one fires first. Hesk Marden asked, "What if he's lying?" Delenn said that if he's lying, then tomorrow at 9 in the morning, everyone will go home and he'll refund everyone for their time. There were no more questions. They spent the night working. Delenn didn't sleep at all that night. He sat by the gate with a lantern, sharpening 2 knives on a whetstone and listening to the city. The city was quiet. Somewhere at the intersection, people were out walking. Somewhere, a dog was barking. At 3:40, he woke Corvin, and the 2 of them went out onto the roof. At 3:55, he glanced at his watch. At 4:09, he told Corvin to look south toward the harbor. At 4:11, the sky above dry dock number 3 cracked. It didn't look like lightning or an explosion. It was simply a vertical streak 40 meters long that appeared in the air at the height of the fifth floor. It was the color of wet asphalt. No light emanated from it. It absorbed the light. 8 seconds later, something began to rain down from it. Corvin didn't say a single word. He stood on the roof, clutching the railing with both hands, his fingers turning white. He had served in the military. He had seen the dead. He knew what fear was. This was different. He looked at the man next to him, and the man next to him looked at his watch and jotted down the time in a notebook. Corvin later said that at that moment, he stopped being afraid of Dalen and began to fear for him. For the first hour, it was quiet on Skladskoy Row. The creatures of the first wave headed for the port and the residential neighborhoods of Nizhny Pier, where there was more noise. Dalen heard sirens and gunfire coming from the south, and at 4:30, he heard one of the sirens fall silent mid-note. At 6 a.m., the radio broadcast an official statement about a man-made accident at the port and urged people not to leave their homes. At 7 o'clock, they repeated the same message. At 8:20, the radio cut off mid-sentence. The lights went out. They didn't go out the way they do during an accident. They went out all at once, stretching all the way to the horizon. Dalen flicked the light switch twice for those standing nearby, and then said one sentence. He said it was forever. Martin sat down on a crate. Rhett stepped outside and threw up. Corvin went to check the locks. What followed were 3 days that Dalen later recalled as one long, gray blur. He slept for 2 hours at a time. He set up around the warehouse the system that, in his previous life, had taken until the 3rd week to develop at the port and had cost 2,000 lives. First phase. On the 24th, in the afternoon, he led 4 men to the intersection of Skladsky Row and Razviazka, where they blocked the street with 2 of Martin's trucks parked across it. This cut off the row from the city. The job took 40 minutes. By evening, people were already gathered by the trucks, begging to be let in. Dalen let 17 people through. He chose them based on a single criterion. He took those who had come with tools or with a child. Second scene. On the morning of the 25th, he led 6 people to the city hospital on Melivoy Hill. Not for medicine, for oxygen tanks and an autoclave. The hospital was already without power and without security, and 3 people were lying in the emergency room. A creature came out of the basement to meet them, and it was the first one they killed. Corvin took it down with 2 blows from a crowbar, and then stood there looking at it and at his hands. A murky clot oozed from the creature's shattered skull, and nestled within the clot was a solid object the size of a finger joint. Dull. Warm. Dalen picked it up, put it in his pocket, and said nothing. Third scene. On the 26th, he took a van and drove to what was left of the pharmacy warehouse at the eastern entrance, took everything that hadn't been looted yet, and returned with 4 boxes. On the way back, he saw what the city looked like on the 3rd day. A line at the gas pump a whole block long. A car lay overturned on its side, ransacked. A man was carrying a roll of linoleum on his shoulder, not understanding why he needed it. Smoke rose in a column above the lower pier and wouldn't dissipate. Dalen watched this through the windshield and felt neither pity nor superiority. He felt only time. Every hour without power cost the city 1,000 people, and he knew that in 19 days the shepherd would come and take the rest if no one took their post on the tower. By the evening of the 26th, 34 people were living in warehouse number 6. Martin's generator was running for 2 hours a day, and there was a designated water distribution schedule based on lists. It was then that Dalen did what he'd been transporting the medicine for. He went into a corner behind the shelves and called only Rhett over to hold things steady. He placed a syringe, an ampule, and a tourniquet on a box. He cut open his left forearm along the gray line, 2 centimeters long. Rhett said he'd gone mad. Dallin placed the grain in the cut and pressed down with his palm. What happened next was what he remembered. A jolt shot from his elbow to his neck. His back arched so that he rose off the floor on his shoulder blades and heels. His jaw clenched. Rhett and Corvin held him down, and Corvin yelled at him to breathe. Dallin couldn't breathe for 40 seconds. On the 42nd second, Rhett jabbed a syringe of anticonvulsant into his thigh, and a minute later, his body went limp. Dalen lay on the concrete, soaked through, staring at the ceiling and laughing quietly, without a sound. He raised his hand. The gray line had shortened by the length of a fingernail. 1 spot out of 31 was taken. He stood up 10 minutes later and lifted the water crate that had previously taken 2 of them to lift. Alone. Easily. He set it down and looked at his hands. It was at that very moment that Rhett Oris stopped asking how Dalen knew. He later told Corvin that he'd realized something simple. Dalen doesn't predict the future. Dalen remembers it. And then came the price of success. On the morning of the 27th, a woman in a blue paramedic's jacket appeared by the trucks at the intersection. She stood in plain sight, holding her hands out, and asked to speak to the supervisor. Corvin led her to the gate. Dalen came out and saw Ilsa Merv. She was 8 years younger than the woman who had stood by the slit under the gate, holding his bag. She had a tired, kind face, and the knuckles of her right hand were bloodied. She said she was a paramedic from the Port Clinic, and that there were 26 people waiting for her in the basement of the school on Upper Street, including 8 children, and that she had run out of water yesterday. She said she'd heard there was a man here who had known about it in advance. Dalen looked at her and remained silent for 8 seconds. Then he said he'd think about it until evening. She left. Corvin said that 26 mouths to feed was a lot. Martin said there were children among them. Rhett said the paramedic was worth 10 sacks of flour. Dalen didn't answer anyone. He climbed onto the roof and stood there until dark, thinking. He wasn't thinking about food. He was thinking that if he took her, he'd have a doctor who, in a year, would send him to the outer line to check a sensor to see if it was working. And he was thinking that 26 people are 26 people. Dalen wiped away the inscription with his sleeve only after he had copied it word for word into his notebook. Then he sat by the gate until midnight, going over everything he remembered about the shepherd. The shepherd climbed onto the water tower on the 19th day and sat there for a full day without moving. And during that time, about 40,000 people left the city. They left on their own. At night, they got up, went to the tower, and didn't come back. In his past life, Dalen hadn't seen this with his own eyes, because back then he and his group were stationed 12 kilometers away at the grain elevator, and for 3 days they heard nothing but footsteps on the asphalt. No gunshots, no screams, just footsteps. If the shepherd arrived early, his entire schedule would fall apart. He had everything planned out for the 19th day. By that date, he intended to have 7 grains, 20 barrels, and a collector with the lower door closed. He recalculated by lamplight. If the shepherd arrived on the 12th day, he would have 4 grains and not a single finished door. He closed his notebook and realized the main point. The stranger didn't scare him. The stranger was giving him a correction to his calculations. That's not what enemies do. For the next 2 days, he tore up the schedule and put it back together. He switched everyone to 12-hour shifts. He put Martin to work welding grates for the collector's lower entrance and sent 6 men there with tools without telling the rest where they were going. He set a condition for Ilsa Merv. He said that her people would receive water, shelter, and protection, and in return, she would prepare 20 stretchers for him and teach 4 people how to apply a tourniquet. She agreed immediately and didn't haggle. She worked better than anyone else there. She was the first to get up. She gave her ration to a boy from her basement who had asthma. Once she lost her temper and yelled at Corvin for having dirty hands, and then she apologized. Dalen watched her every day and saw a good person. And every day he remembered the light from the lantern shining through the crack under the gate. He couldn't connect the two, so he stopped trying. He did something simple. He started a separate page for her in his notebook and wrote down what she did and who she talked to. On the third day, he wrote down the first thing. Ilsa went out to the trucks twice and spoke through the crack with a man outside, and then said he was her neighbor. He wrote down the second thing on the fifth day. 4 vials of anticonvulsants were missing from the pharmacy cabinet. They hadn't been stolen outright. They'd been written off in the logbook in neat handwriting as administered to a patient who had already been healthy for 2 days by that point. Dalen didn't say anything. He transferred the remaining vials to the collection bin that same night. And on the 7th day, Hagar Crane arrived from the south. He arrived openly in the middle of the day and brought 19 men with him. 4 of them were in port security uniforms and carried pump-action shotguns. He stopped 30 meters from the trucks, raised his hands, and asked to speak to the supervisor. Dalen came out himself. They stood there looking at each other across 30 meters of broken asphalt. Hagar had lost weight and grown a beard over the past week, and he had a fresh scrape on his cheekbone. He began to speak, and he spoke well. He said that about 600 people remained in the port and that they were stuck in the terminal without water. He said he'd taken responsibility for them because there was no one else to do so. He said he'd heard there was a man here who'd known everything in advance. He said he wasn't going to demand anything and that he was proposing they joined forces, that he had people and weapons, while Dalen had a warehouse and knowledge. He said that together, they would save the city. Dalen listened to him and recalled how that same voice had once said they wouldn't give up 30 people for just one. He replied briefly. He said the warehouse was closed. He said he could supply the terminal with 200 liters of water per day and not a single liter more, and that Hagar's people would have to pick it up themselves, unarmed. Hagar dropped his hands. He said that wasn't serious. He said that 600 people weren't just 200 liters. Dalen said he knew arithmetic better than he did. Hagar stood there a little longer and then said one last thing. He said he'd come back again and that he hoped for a different answer. He left. Corvin said it had been a reconnaissance mission. Dalen said it had been a test. He said that Hagar had come to see how many guns they had, where the trucks were parked, and who was coming out to the gates. And he told Corvin to step up security at night and not let anyone out after dark. That night, Ilsa Merv went out to the trucks for the 3rd time. Corvin saw it himself and reported it. She returned 11 minutes later. Dalen listened and did nothing. He merely ordered that 40 more canisters, the last sawed-off shotgun, both boxes of ammunition, and the lists of people be taken to the collection point that very night. He took everything that couldn't be lost. A lot remained in warehouse number 6, left in plain sight, and that was exactly what he was prepared to give up. In the morning, he gathered Corvin, Rhett, and Martin in a nook behind the shelves and told them 3 things. He said that people would come to the warehouse that night or the next. He said they wouldn't come through the main gate, but through the side door by the dead-end alley because someone from the inside would open it. And he said they wouldn't be the ones to shoot first. Rhett asked who would open it. Dalen didn't answer. Martin asked why they were even keeping the warehouse open at all. Dalen said that the warehouse was the price he was paying to ensure that all 70 people would be under the hill that night instead of here. He explained the procedure. At the signal, everyone would exit through the north ramp in single file and walk 4 kilometers to pumping station number 9 on foot and without lights. Children and the sick would go first. They wouldn't tell Ilsa Merv about the route until the very moment they left. It all began at 4:05. Dalen was lying fully clothed on a folding cot and hadn't been sleeping. He heard someone get up in the west wing. Then he heard the latch turn in the side door. It was a very quiet sound. He got up and went toward it. Ilsa Merv was standing by the open door in the darkness, her hand on the doorframe. She saw him and didn't run. She stood there looking at him, her face wet with tears. She said quickly, in a whisper, that her brother was with Hagar, that he'd been held in the terminal since yesterday, and that they'd promised her they wouldn't harm anyone. They were just there to take the food. She said she had 26 people and 8 children, and that she had no other choice. Dallin looked at her, and in that moment, he understood everything about his past death. There was no conspiracy. There was no hatred. There was simply a man who, each time, chose those he held in his hands. And on the breakwater, he was the one she hadn't held with her hands. He said one sentence to her. He said that she had made a choice a second time and that he didn't remember the first one out loud. She didn't understand. They were already coming through the door. The first one stabbed him in the side with a knife before he had time to turn around. The blade went in under his lower rib and came out 2 centimeters, and Dallin felt cold and then heat. He grabbed the man by the wrist, broke his arm at the elbow, and knocked him down. After that, everything happened quickly. Corvin struck from the left in the darkness, and 4 others struck with him. Rhett led the first group out through the north ramp as agreed. Marden led the second. Inside the warehouse, people were screaming, crates were falling, and someone was firing into the ceiling to scare them. Dallin stood by the side door, holding the passageway, and a sharp pain shot through his side with every breath. He took down 3 of them, and the 4th ran off on his own. And then a sound came from outside, from the direction of the dry dock, low and steady. The kind of sound you hear when a great many feet are running across concrete, and not a single one breaks the rhythm. Hagar's men heard it first, and the doorway was immediately empty. Dallin followed them out into the open air and saw it. A wave was advancing along Warehouse Row from the intersection. Not the first wave, the second. Short, swift creatures were advancing as a dense mass toward the sound of battle, and they were still 300 meters away. In his past life, the second wave had reached the port on the 14th day. Today was the 8th. The stranger hadn't lied. The timeline had shifted. Dallin pressed his palm against his side and looked at the blood on his fingers. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small bag. Inside the bag were 4 grains he'd collected over the past week, but hadn't had time to plant because he'd been saving the anticonvulsant. He made up his mind in a single second. He already had a wound, open and deep, wide enough to fit 3 fingers. He scooped out all 4 seeds at once and pressed them into the wound beneath his rib, pressed down on top with his palm, and sat down on the concrete with his back against the wall. His body arched back immediately. He hit the back of his head against the wall, bit his tongue, and everything went white before his eyes. He didn't hear Corvin yelling in his face, nor did he feel them dragging him along the ramp. He hung somewhere in between, counting his heartbeats, and on the 109th beat, it all ended at once. He opened his eyes and saw the sky, and against the sky, the face of Rhett Oris, and realized they were carrying him. He told them to set him down. They set him down. He was standing on his own 2 feet, 200 meters from his own warehouse, watching as a second wave poured through the open gates and the lights inside went out. 8 days of work, 300 square meters. Everything he'd bought for $3 million. He raised his left arm and looked at his forearm. The gray line had shortened by a third, 5 out of 31. He turned and walked toward the column, walking alone with no one supporting him. Ahead, in the darkness, 72 people were walking along the road to Chalk Hill. Behind him, in the ransacked warehouse, Hagar Crane's men had encountered the second wave, and Dallin could hear what was happening there, but didn't stop even once. By 6 in the morning, the column had descended into the collector beneath pumping station number 9. Marden closed the top grate and welded it shut from the inside in 40 minutes. Down below, it was dry and smelled of lime, and the ventilation was working. Dallin sat in the dark for 40 minutes, then stood up, lit a lantern, and began to count. He counted for 4 hours, jotting everything down in his notebook by the light of the lantern. 72 people. Of these, 19 were children under the age of 12, 6 were elderly, and 4 were wounded. 4,500 liters of water in containers. At 5 liters per person per day, that's enough for 12 days. Food for 26 days, based on 1 meal per day. 40 cans of diesel, or 800 liters. A 3-kilowatt Marden generator. 1 sawed-off shotgun, and 41 rounds of ammunition. 9 crowbars, 4 axes, and 12 knives. 11 ampules of anticonvulsant instead of 15. 5 grains, and all 5 were already in his hand. He finished writing the line and underlined it twice. 12 days. That was all he had. After that, it was either water or death. In the morning, he gathered everyone on the lower level and spoke for 6 minutes. He didn't try to offer any comfort. He said the number 12 out loud and waited for it to sink in. Then he said that the collector had been built in '74 for 400 people, that there was a private well 110 meters deep beneath it, and that there was water in it. He said that only the second circuit pump was out of commission. He said they had 12 days to get that pump up and running, and that all other tasks were insignificant in comparison. Then he assigned the work. Miv Tall was a maintenance technician at the paper mill and knew her way around bearings. He put her in charge of the pump and assigned her Marden, his son, and 4 others. Rhett was put in charge of inventory, distribution, and the lists. Corvin was assigned both doors and the night shift. It took 3 days to get the pump up and running, and Dalen later remembered only 3 images from those days. The first. Miv Tall is crouching in front of the open housing, scooping out a brown paste with her hand and saying that the bearing has fused into a single solid mass and that there isn't another one of that size in the city. Second. Marden stands by the ventilation duct, cutting the exhaust fan's mounting bracket with an angle grinder, a shower of sparks flying around him, and everyone realizes that he's now robbing them of half their air for the sake of water. Third. 4 o'clock in the morning on the 3rd day. A single light bulb is burning in the manifold. Miv closes the cover and nods, and Rhett flips the switch. At first, the pipe snorts out air. Then rust comes out. Rust flows for 20 minutes, and then the water runs clear. 72 people stood in the concrete corridor, silent, watching the stream. No one shouted. A woman from Ilsa Merv's basement cupped her hands under the stream and held them there until they ached from the cold. Dalen jotted down a new figure in his notebook. The well was yielding 40 liters per minute. 12 days had turned into an indefinite period in the space of 3 days and had cost half the ventilation system. And at that very moment, he gained his first real enemy from within. His name was Derv Cult. He had come with Ilsa Merv's people from the school basement and was something of a leader there. He was stocky, spoke loudly, and knew how to rally people around him. He waited until the water started flowing and began speaking that very same day. He said that Ilsa Merv had been treating patients for 14 hours straight, that she'd given her share to the boy with asthma, and that she'd been left alone upstairs. He said that no one had gone to look for her. He said that a person who abandons their paramedic would abandon anyone. He wasn't lying about a single word, and that was the worst part. By evening, 11 people were standing with him. Rhett wanted to take him out to the bars, but Dalen forbade it. He said that in a day, this conversation would end on its own. He didn't explain anything and didn't mention the side door or how the latch turned at 4:05. He didn't utter Ilsa Merv's name out loud even once during all that time. Instead, he sat down with his notebook and counted the grains. 5 out of 31. After the 5th grain, the density increased so much that he could carry on his own what had previously required 3 people to lift, and he simply wouldn't have noticed a knife in his side now. But 5 was nothing. He remembered those who'd made it to 20. He remembered that during the first 20 days, all the easy nests in the city would be wiped out, and after that, the grain could only be taken through combat and at a cost. He opened a map of the city and marked a cross on it, the tram depot on the northern slope of Chalk Hill. In his past life, no one had gone in there until the 40th day, and when they finally did, they lost 14 men and found only empty shells inside. Dallin knew why. The first wave fled from the light into the wet and dark and gathered in the nest. The clutch incubated for 11 days, and on the 12th day, the nest's master emerged from it and carried the clutch away. Until the 12th day, the clutch was motionless and defenseless, containing between 20 and 30 eggs. It was the 10th day. He had less than 2 days left. He took 8 people, Corvin and Retta, 4 of Corvin's men, and Miv Tall, because there was a substation at the depot that needed to be inspected. The 8th man he took was Derv Kalt. He called his name in front of everyone and didn't explain why. Kalt stood there for about 3 seconds, then grabbed a crowbar and set off. They emerged above ground at 6 in the morning. By the 10th day, the city was no longer smoldering. It just stood there. Not a single car was moving, not a single intact window on the first floors. At the intersection of the upper street, a bus lay on its side. Someone had set up a makeshift home inside, and the smell of a campfire wafted from it. Yet no one came out to see who was approaching. It was 2 kilometers to the depot, and it took them 40 minutes to walk there because Dallin led the group through alleys and never once took them out into the open. The depot gates stood wide open. Inside, it was dark and damp. Water was dripping from the ceiling, and the entire floor was covered with a layer of something sticky. The package lay at the far end of the pit beneath the 3rd track. It looked like a gray sack 3 times the height of a person, and it was breathing. Creatures were sitting around it. Dallin counted them from the ramp and came to 41. He explained the plan in a minute. He said that the creatures in the first wave were drawn to sound, but not to light, and that each weighed about 40 kilograms and struck with such force that it could break a person's collarbone in a single blow. He said that in open combat, 8 men against 41 would mean all 8 would be killed. Therefore, there would be no fight. He said he would go in alone, stand in the middle of the pit, and make noise. He said all 41 would go after him, and while they were on him, Miv and 2 others would break open the wall at the northern end and take out everything inside. He said the rest of them weren't to hit a single one of those creatures until he gave the signal. Corvin asked how long he'd have to stand there. Dallin said he didn't know, and that they were about to find out. He climbed down into the pit, walked to the middle, and struck a rail with a crowbar. The sound echoed throughout the depot. 41 heads turned at once. The first one reached him in 4 seconds and struck him in the chest. 8 months ago, a blow like that would have folded him in half. Now, he shifted half a step and remained standing. The second one grabbed his thigh and hung on. The third and fourth struck him in the back. He didn't strike back. He stood in the middle of the pit, holding the crowbar down, and let them climb on top of him. Within a minute, more than 20 were hanging on him. He dropped to one knee and stood back up. After 3 minutes, he stopped counting the blows and began counting his breaths. Miv Tall slit open the husk from the northern end in the 7th minute. Inside lay the seeds. She scooped them out with both hands into a canvas bag, and Derv Kalt held the bag open, staring not into it. He was looking into the pit. He later recounted this 11 times in a single week, and each time the story was exactly the same. He said he saw a man beneath a layer of creatures 2 bodies thick. He said that this man did not scream or struggle, and that every few seconds a back would rise from beneath the mass and straighten again. He said he stood there with the sack in his hands and at some point realized a simple truth. The man he had called a coward yesterday in front of everyone was now standing between 41 of those creatures and his own children, and he had nothing to gain from it. Colt threw the sack to Miv and jumped into the pit himself. He struck their backs with a crowbar, dragged them by their hind legs, and screamed without words. A second later, Corvin jumped in, followed by the rest. Dallin said one word, and after that word, they worked for 11 minutes. 4 of the 41 were gone. Dallin was the last to climb out of the pit, his jacket hanging on him by 2 sleeves. He sat down on the concrete and Rhett cut open his clothes, revealing that his skin was intact, blue from shoulder to hip, but intact. Miv held up the sack, 26 grains. They picked out 3 more from the creatures on the floor, 29. On the way back, Dervkalt carried the bag himself, didn't hand it to anyone, and remained silent the whole way. At the bars, he turned to Delenn and said only that there were no more questions. Delenn said it was a good question, and that he'd answer it later. That evening, he administered 4 grains in a row. He had 11 ampules left, and he used 4. The first one was tough. For the second, 5 people had to hold him down. On the third, he lost consciousness, and Miv slapped him on the cheeks while Rhett counted aloud. The 4th dose went by almost calmly, and that frightened him the most. The gray line on his forearm had shortened even further, 9 out of 31. In the morning, he lifted a 200-liter barrel of water off the concrete, carried it up the stairs in his arms, set it down on the top landing, and turned around. About 40 people were standing below, watching. Delenn didn't say anything to them. He wrote in his notebook that after the 9th grain, weight ceased to matter, that the speed hadn't changed at all, and that this meant the grain provided only one thing, and he needed to find something to supplement that one thing. And then came the price. By 11 o'clock on the 11th day, Corvin climbed up to the top grate and came back down very quickly. He said there were people up there. Delenn climbed up himself. Through the bars of the grate, he saw the platform in front of the pumping station, and on the platform stood 40 people. Children, women, 2 on stretchers. Delenn looked through the bars at his own handwriting and counted not people, but consequences. 41 people meant 41 mouths to feed, 9 extra pairs of working hands, and Kald's machine gun with its 8 barrels. But there was more to it than that. It was the first official document of the new world. He told Corvin to open the upper grate. Martin cut the seam for 40 minutes, and the whole time, both sides stood there in silence. He met with Kalda on the lower level at the table with the map and spoke with him for 2 hours. The captain listened as one listens to an order. He didn't argue once. He only clarified the figures and jotted them down in his notebook in the same handwriting he'd used 2 weeks earlier to record the crazy crane operator in the logbook. Dallin gave him everything he could give without risk. He named the day when the last diesel generators in the city would shut down. He named 4 locations where long-term storage warehouses still remained untouched. He named the most important ones. He said that in a day or 2, what he called the Shepherd would land on the water tower on the eastern ridge, and that after that, people all over the city would start getting up at night and heading toward the tower on their own. Kald looked up from his notebook and asked what "on their own" meant. Dallin said it meant exactly what he had said. He explained that a person gets up at night, leaves their shelter, walks 3 kilometers on foot, doesn't respond if called out to, and doesn't resist if held, but starts to fight if held for too long. He said that last time, about 40,000 people left the city that way in a single day. Kald closed his notebook and said that "last time" was a very strange way of putting it. Dallin said he didn't have another way to put it. The captain sat in silence. Then he said that in 19 years of service, he'd learned to distinguish between nonsense and a report, and that this was a report. He set his assault rifle on the table and said that his men were placing themselves under general command, and that he was taking charge of maintaining order and handling the weapons. Vale Sarn arrived the next morning. He came alone and brought 12 men and 3 operational vehicles. His vehicles were running on diesel fuel that he'd hauled out of the storage area the day before the second wave. He had 380 men at the grain elevator, and he wasn't managing them well, and he knew it. He walked into the collection chamber and looked at the well, the ventilation system, the lists on the wall, and the children being fed on schedule, and then told Dallin that he had won. He said that he himself had the equipment, the people, and the walls, but lacked one thing. He didn't have the next line. He said he was ready to bring 380 people under one command, and that Dallin should set the terms. Dallin laid them out in 4 minutes. 1 distribution and 1 list for everyone. The weapons would remain with Sarn's men and be under Kald's command. All the grain goes into a single sack, and he personally distributes it, and no one else. And he spoke the final conditions slowly. He said that no one in this city is to approach dry dock number 3 or anything coming out of it without his direct order. Sarn asked what was there. Dallin said there was a door there, that the door worked both ways, and that it was too early to talk about it. By the evening of the 12th day, Chalk Hill was no longer a collection chamber housing 72 people. It had become a place where 509 people lived. Dallin brought them up from underground, a decision that went against every instinct, and he explained it only once. He said that the collector was a tomb with a single door, and that a tomb could not be expanded. He said that the pumping station stood on a cliff, that there was a precipice on 3 sides, and that the perimeter here was 240 meters instead of 2 kilometers at the port. He said that if they stayed trapped in the concrete, they'd die within a month from the air, the cramped conditions, and the fact that they'd stop going outside. It took 3 days to build the wall. Once again, he wouldn't let anyone describe it, except for 3 images in his own mind. First, Sarna's people drag the body of a refrigerated truck to the cliff edge, place it across the entrance, and weld it shut. Second, Derv Kalt teaches 14 people from the school basement how to tie barbed wire to rebar, and his own hands are covered in blood up to his elbows. Third, Miv Tall climbs onto the roof of the pump house with a coil of wire and hangs tin cans on guy wires all around the perimeter because there's no electricity for an alarm system, but there's sound. Sound. By evening on the 14th day, the perimeter was set up, and then night fell on the 15th. Dallin hadn't slept. He was standing on the roof of the pump house with binoculars, looking east. The entire eastern ridge was visible from there. The water tower stood on it like a black pillar. At 2:40 a.m., it seemed to him that the pillar had grown thicker. He watched for another 20 minutes until he was certain. Something was sitting on the top ring of the tower. It wasn't moving. It was the size of a bus, and not a single detail of it was discernible. It was simply sitting there, darker than the sky. Dallin went downstairs and woke up Kald, Sarn, and Corvin, and told them 3 sentences. He said that the shepherd had landed on the tower 4 days ahead of schedule. He said that in about 2 hours, people would start waking up. He said that it wouldn't be strangers waking up. The first to wake up was a boy named Lane, the one with asthma to whom Ilsa Merv had given her ration. He sat up on the mattress and opened his eyes. They looked normal, and he looked at the woman who had helped him up but didn't recognize her. He stood up and walked toward the gate. A minute later, 4 more got up. 10 minutes later, people were rising all over the pumping station grounds and walking in one direction in silence. They were being grabbed by the arms. They were held in pairs, 2 to a person. Those who were stronger were restrained. A mother held her son, and he struggled in her arms for 40 minutes, then began to cry, returned to his normal self, and remembered nothing. By 4 in the morning, out of 509, 163 had stood up, and 159 had been restrained. 4 got away. One of them climbed over the back of a refrigerated truck with his bare hands and tore open his stomach on a barbed wire fence, but he kept going down the slope anyway, made it to the road, and didn't look back. Kald watched this from the roof, and then sat down on the concrete and said aloud that there were 300,000 in the city. Delenn corrected him. He said there were about 60,000 left in the city, and that by morning there would be 30,000. He said that the shepherd would stay in the tower for exactly 24 hours and then leave with those who had made it, and that after that, no one would ever find a single body. Sarn asked if it was okay to kill him. Delenn didn't answer right away. He thought for 16 seconds. He thought about how, in his past life, no one had answered that question at all because no one had approached the tower. He thought about how he had 9 grains and that he didn't know the upper limit of his density, and that he would have to test it on a creature that kills 40,000 people in a day without making a single movement. He thought about the fact that if the shepherd left, he would return in 80 days and would already be on the elevator. Then he said he didn't know if it was possible to kill him. He said he knew something else. He said there were 2 hours left until dawn, and that he would go to the tower at dawn. Kald stood up and said he would provide 9 guns. Sarn said he'd provide vehicles and 8 men. Corvin said nothing. He went downstairs and returned 10 minutes later with 2 bags. The first contained 20 grains. The second contained 7 vials. He placed them on the concrete in front of Delenn and said they had to be planted right now, and that was it. Delenn looked at the 2 bags on the concrete and said that 20 grains in a row would kill him. He explained why. He said that each successive grain caused a longer spasm than the previous one, and that after the 9th, it would knock him out for 40 seconds. He said that after the 15th, the count would go into minutes, and that his heart would simply stop during the spasm, and no ampule would be able to stop it. He said he'd take 6. He administered them from 4 to 5:40 in the morning in the boiler room of the pumping station, with 5 people watching him. Rhett held his head. Corvin held his left arm. Miv Tall administered the drug on the count. On the 4th dose, he stopped breathing for 1 minute and 20 seconds, and Miv punched him in the sternum with both fists until he took a breath. On the 6th dose, everything went almost smoothly. He got up from the floor on his own and felt lightheaded. He looked at his forearm. The gray line had faded to the middle. 15 out of 31. He lifted the 400-kilogram pump frame off the floor, held it aloft, and set it back down. Then he went outside and threw up. 18 men set out for the tower in 3 vehicles at 6:20 a.m. Kald with 9 barrels, Corvin and 3 of his men, Rhett, Hesk Marden with his son, because Marden was the only one who knew how to work at heights and with metal, and Delenn. Miv stayed behind. Derv Kalt stayed behind and was ordered to secure the perimeter and keep the men together. If no one returned by evening, he was to lead everyone down into the collector and weld the grate shut from the inside. The eastern ridge was 6 kilometers away. They covered that distance in an hour and walked the last kilometer on foot because the road was blocked. Delenn saw that road and remembered it forever. People were walking along the asphalt. They weren't running or crowding together. They moved in an even stream along both lanes in one direction. Old people, women carrying children in their arms, a man wearing only 1 boot. There were so many of them that the stream didn't break for a single second, and as far as the eye could see, it stretched up the slope toward the tower and vanished there. No one spoke. Only footsteps could be heard. The squad marched against the flow, and the people flowed around them without looking at them. Kald walked with his hand on the strap of his assault rifle, his jaw trembling. He later said that in 19 years of service, he had seen it all, and that he had never seen anything more terrifying than a silent line of people marching. The tower stood on a concrete foundation and was 42 meters high. Below, around it, was a trampled circle 80 meters in diameter, and people were standing within that circle. They were simply standing, shoulder to shoulder, facing the tower. Dalen counted more than 3,000 people in the circle and realized that these were only the ones who had arrived that night. The shepherd sat on the upper ring. Even up close, he couldn't make out any details. It was like a hole shaped like a crouching beast. Dalen stared at it for 40 seconds and felt pressure in his head. It wasn't a voice. It was the sensation that he was already late and that he needed to get closer. It was calm and pleasant, and it made him want to stop thinking. He punched himself in the wounded side, and the pressure receded. He turned around and saw that Martin had taken 2 steps forward, his eyes vacant. His son grabbed him by the shoulders and held him back. Dalen gave the order. He said that no one was to enter the circle except him. He said that Cald would set up the barrels on the concrete guardrail 70 meters away and fire only on his signal and only at the upper belt. He told Martin and his son to go to the base on the east side, where the service ladder stood, and cut the support braces. He said they had to cut 3 of the 4 and leave the northern one alone. He explained why. He said they wouldn't be able to kill that creature with anything they had. He said they could bring the tower down. He entered the circle alone. He walked through the crowd of people, and they didn't part, so he pushed them aside with his shoulder. 3,000 people stood facing the tower and didn't notice him. He reached the base, struck the concrete with a crowbar, and let out a roar. The shepherd turned his head. It was his first movement in 9 hours. And in that very second, the 3,000 people in the circle turned with him. Dalen couldn't explain it in words afterward, and he didn't try. The people didn't attack the way people usually do. They surged at him as a single mass, grabbing and crushing him, all in silence. He held them off at the base of the tower for 12 minutes. He didn't strike a single one. He stood in the narrow space between the support and the concrete pedestal, catching them with his hands, pushing them aside and catching them again. 15 grains withstood the pressure of 3,000 bodies. His feet sank into the concrete up to his ankles. From the guardrail, Cald saw only a writhing mass, and within that mass, a motionless point. Martin was cutting the diagonal braces. He'd burned through 2 discs and was operating the gas-powered cutter while balancing it on his son's shoulder. He cut through the first diagonal in 9 minutes, the second in 6. On the third one from the top, the shepherd came down. He didn't jump. He simply ended up below. When he landed, the concrete beneath him gave way, and the 3 people closest to him were crushed instantly. Up close, he was 4 times the height of a human and had no features other than his shape. Dalen managed to say one word. Cald opened fire on the upper belt, and 9 barrels pounded the metal above the shepherd's head to make him raise his head. He did. And then Hesk Martin did what Dalen hadn't ordered him to do. He cut through the northern diagonal. The tower collapsed. 42 meters of steel and 400 metric tons of water in the tank collapsed inward and fell onto the eastern side. At that moment, Martin was standing beneath it with a gas-powered cutter in his hands. His son managed to jump out of the way because his father had pushed him. The tank struck the shepherd from above in the back, driving him into his own crater, and a wave of water as tall as a man spread out in a circle. Dalen saw a mass of people in the circle fall all at once. Not from the water. All 3,000 fell in a single second, as if the threads holding them up had snapped. He waded toward the crater, knee-deep in water and mud. Pastuk was alive. He was lying under the tank, pinned down, and was pulling his front limb out from under the metal and scraping against the concrete. The pressure in Dalen's head became so intense that he lost sight in his left eye. He reached him. He picked up a severed crossbeam 3 meters long and weighing 200 kilograms from the ground and placed its end where the creature's head met its body, then struck it from above with a crowbar as one drives a pile into the ground. He struck it 41 times. He counted aloud, and they could hear him from the guardrail. On the 41st blow, the pressure in its head vanished all at once, and it became very quiet. Steam rose from the crater. In the mud next to the body lay a grain the size of a fist. It was not matte, but transparent, and something was moving inside it. Delen picked it up and did not put it in the bag. He held it in his hand the whole way back. Of the 3,000 people in the circle, about 900 got to their feet. The rest never stood up. Those who did stand up remembered nothing and didn't understand where they were, and many of them were not from that part of the city. The squad gathered them up until dark. Hesk Marden was pulled out from under the tank 2 hours later. Delen carried him to the car himself and didn't let anyone else take him. They returned to the pumping station at 9 in the evening, bringing 430 people with them, and led the rest in groups throughout the night. Delen hadn't slept for 3 days straight. He found Marden's daughter on the lower level, told her everything himself, and stood before her while she punched him in the chest. Then he picked up her son and held him until he fell asleep, and wrote both of their names in the first line of the list for permanent rations in his own hand. Heske Marden was buried on the cliff behind the pumping station at dawn on the 16th day. Everyone came. 509 of their own and 430 newcomers. Rhett Oris spoke for 3 minutes, mostly about how Marden had brought a generator and 2 boxes of nails to the warehouse and hadn't asked a single question. Miv Tal couldn't speak at all. Corvin said 1 sentence. He said that the old man had cut through the northern slope, knowing what lay beneath it. Delen said nothing. He stood at the edge, holding a transparent seed in his pocket and looking down at the city. And that same evening, Yerm Kald brought him a radio up to the roof. It was an army radio, and it worked. It could receive signals. On the emergency frequency, someone was repeating the same message every 4 minutes. The voice was female and recorded. It reported that the Eastern District Command had regained control of the Strelecka Crossing hub, that all organized groups of survivors were ordered to make contact, and that evacuation was guaranteed in exchange for information about the city of Canehall. Delen listened to the recording 6 times in a row. Then he told Kald that they shouldn't respond. Kald asked why. Delen said that in his past life, the Eastern District Command had entered Canehall on the 28th day and had left 9 days later, taking with them everything they could carry, including people. Kald didn't argue on the roof. He went back downstairs and didn't go on the air. But there was more than one radio. A day later, someone responded on the emergency frequency from the grain elevator, and from the river port, and from 4 other locations as well, and Delen realized that staying silent was pointless. He changed his mind and did the opposite. He ordered Kald to go on the air, report the coordinates of Chalk Hill and their numbers, and request a meeting. Sarn asked why he should invite those he himself had called marauders. Delen said that others would call them anyway, and that he preferred to meet his guests on his own cliff rather than in an open field. It took 18 days for Chalk Hill to stop looking like a camp. First cut. Overnight, Sarn's men hauled 6 containers to the area in front of the pump house, lined them up, laid planks across them, and built a 4-meter wall with a platform for the gunners. Second update. Miv Tal got the second of the 3 destroyed generators up and running, and 4 lamps lit up above the gate, the first electric lighting in the city in 18 days, visible from the river. Third scene. Over the course of a day, Rhett Oris compiled a list of all 940 people, noting their professions, added 41 people with useful skills to the list, and posted it on the wall so everyone could see where they stood. The Eastern District Command arrived on the morning of the 20th. They didn't arrive the way Sarn had expected. 2 cars, 1 armored personnel carrier, and 18 men arrived. The senior officer was Colonel Vern Strack. He was nearing 50, lean and polite, with a very weary voice. He stepped onto the platform and looked at the wall, the lamps, and the line for water, which was moving according to the lists and without any shouting. He said that in 11 days he had passed through 4 cities and had seen nothing like this in any of them. The conversation took place on the platform in front of everyone, and Delenn had arranged it that way on purpose. Strack spoke well and made reasonable proposals. He suggested designating Chalk Hill as a strategic hub, stationing a platoon there, providing medical supplies and fuel, and conducting a census of the population. He proposed evacuating children and the elderly to the Streletsky Crossing. He spoke about restoring the state without any grandstanding, and it was clear that he believed in it. And then he named his price. He said that all crystals obtained from the creatures were a strategic resource and subject to centralized collection, and that in exchange for everything listed, the command expected the transfer of the available stockpile. He asked how many there were. Dallin said 23. Strack said that was a lot and that, given such a large number, they should have already been distributed among the fighters. Dallin said they couldn't be distributed. Strack asked why. And that's when Dallin did what he'd brought the entire conversation out onto the plaza for, in front of 900 witnesses. He said that over the past week in this city, 8 people had tried to insert a crystal without the medication, and all 8 had died within 2 minutes from convulsions. He said he had only 3 vials of anticonvulsant left for the entire hill. He said that the crystal could only be inserted into an open wound, and that the body reacted to it in such a way that it broke its own spine, and that whoever distributed 23 crystals to 23 fighters would end up with 23 corpses and not a single fighter left. He said he was ready to hand all 23 over to command on one condition. Let the colonel insert one into himself right now in front of everyone and show how it's done correctly. Strack was silent. He wasn't a coward, and it was obvious. He was silent because he was thinking. Dallin didn't let him finish his count. He took off his jacket, rolled up his left sleeve, revealed his forearm with a gray line, and said how many were in it. 15. He said he'd gotten the first one on the 4th day, that each subsequent one had been harder, and that after the 9th, he hadn't breathed for 1 minute and 20 seconds. Then he walked over to the armored personnel carrier and asked the colonel for his men. He said he was asking them to beat him, and to beat him hard, and that he would stand completely still. Strack said it was a circus. Dallin said it was the only way to explain in 1 minute what takes a week. Strack nodded to his men. The first one struck him in the chest with the butt of his rifle. Dallin didn't budge. The second one struck him in the back, just below the shoulder blade. Dallin stood there. Then 3 of them beat him, and they beat him for a long time. One of them split his eyebrow open, and blood ran into his eye, but he didn't raise his hand to wipe it away. He stood there for 50 seconds. Then he grabbed the butt of the nearest assault rifle with 2 fingers, stopped it in midair, and held it there until the soldier let go of the weapon. And at that moment, there wasn't a single sound on the entire square. Colonel Vern Strack watched this, and his expression remained unchanged for a long time. He later recounted this at a council meeting at the Strelets Crossing, and he spoke very matter-of-factly. He said that during the 11 days of the journey, he had seen 4 cities, and in each one he had seen the same thing. He said that everywhere, those who had managed to seize the supply depot were the ones who survived, that they all looked the same, and that he knew how to talk to people like that. He said that on Chalk Hill he saw something different, and realized it only when he looked not at the man at gunpoint, but at the 900 people around him. He said they weren't rejoicing or cheering. He said they stood in silence and looked the way one looks at a load-bearing wall of one's own home. Strack raised his hand and stopped his men. He said the issue with the crystals was off the table. He said he was proposing something else. He offered Delenn a seat on the district council, proposed moving a field hospital to Chalk Hill, and proposed a supply line. He said outright that he needed someone who knew what was coming next. Delenn accepted 2 of the 3 proposals. He took the hospital and the supply line and declined the seat on the council. He explained this in a single sentence. He said that in 8 days his words would cease to be a prophecy, and that he preferred to speak to the council from this cliff. Strack left that same day, leaving behind 4 liaison officers and 6 boxes of medical supplies. In those boxes were 240 vials of anticonvulsants. The 21st and 22nd days changed everything. Word of Chalk Hill spread along the river and the roads faster than any radio transmission. People kept coming up from below non-stop. By the end of the 22nd day, there were 1,400 of them. 3 groups arrived in full with their leaders, and all 3 accepted the common list. 2 men came from the grain elevator and reported that 70 people remained there and that Sarn had done the right thing by leaving. Noel Dries from Bank Security arrived in worn-out boots and without a notebook, and Delenn took him in and assigned him to warehouse inventory. Dries worked for him for 4 months afterward and turned out to be the best warehouse clerk Delenn had ever seen. Over the course of those 2 days, Delenn distributed 11 crystals. He assigned them himself. He chose not the strong ones, but the calm ones. Corvin was the first to receive one. Derv Kalt was second. Miv Tall was third, and she suffered the worst seizure of all and couldn't hold a spoon for 3 days afterward. The 8 people with crystals became what called the first line, a term that was later renamed, and that name stuck for many years. They were called the Dense Ones. And on the night of the 23rd day, Rhett Oris climbed up to Delenn on the roof and said that more people had arrived from down by the river, and that among them was one whom Delenn would want to see. Delenn went down to the gates. Behind the containers, illuminated by 4 lamps, stood a group of 200 people. They were in very poor condition. At the front, kneeling in the mud, stood a man whose face Delenn would have recognized in any condition. Hagar Crane raised his head and looked at the lamps above the gate, at the wall, and at the people on the platform, and spoke loudly so that everyone could hear. He said he had come to ask a favor. Delenn stepped out from behind the containers and stood 3 steps away from him without saying a word. Hagar spoke for 7 minutes, and he spoke very well. He didn't make excuses. He said that warehouse number 6 had been overrun by the second wave, and that of his 19 men, only 4 had survived that night. He said that after that, he gathered everyone he could in the terminal and kept them there for 11 days, and that during those 11 days, 140 people had died under his watch. He said he had made every mistake he possibly could have made. He said he admitted to the raid on the warehouse and was ready to face the consequences, whatever they might be. He said that 203 people were behind him, including 60 children, and that he wasn't pleading for himself. He asked them to take the others in and leave him outside. And then he did something Delenn hadn't anticipated. He named the reason. He said that all those days he'd been thinking about a single conversation by the trucks, and that Delenn had told him then that he knew arithmetic better than he did. He said that now he knew it too. He said that 203 people were more than one man named Hagar Crane. He said this while kneeling in the mud, and there was nothing in his voice but weariness. He believed every word he spoke. Delenn stood there looking at him and heard something entirely different. He heard the very same arithmetic that, in 380 days, would add up to 30 against 1 and lower the lever on the gate. Nothing had changed. The man simply hadn't yet reached the point where that arithmetic turns into murder. A woman stepped forward from behind Hagar. Ilsa Merv was holding the hand of a man in his 30s. It was her brother, Ted, and he was alive, and he was very thin. She didn't get down on her knees. She took 2 steps closer than she should have and began to speak. She said she had opened the side door. She said this loudly, in front of everyone, and didn't soften a single word. She said that her brother had been held captive behind her back, that she'd been promised no one would get hurt, and that she'd believed it because she wanted to believe it. She said that after that, she'd walked with Hagar's people for 6 days, tending to them, and that she had no right to ask for anything. She said she was asking only for the children. Then she looked at Dalen and said one last thing. She said there was one thing she didn't understand. She said he knew. She said she'd seen his face that night by the door and that he'd been waiting for her there. She asked why he'd been waiting by the door alone instead of taking her by the hand the day before and settling everything. There were 1,400 people in the square, and the gate was lit by 4 lamps, and everyone heard it. Dalen was silent for 11 seconds. Then he answered her, and answered her specifically, not speaking to the crowd. He said he would have taken her by the hand the day before if he'd believed it would change anything. He said she'd made her choice twice. He said the second time was at the door at 4:05. He said he'd never talk about the first time. She didn't understand. She stood there looking at him, and you could tell she was going over everything that had happened in her head, but couldn't find the first time. She never found it, not even at the very end. Then the crowd began to speak. Dalen knew it would happen, and yet he wasn't ready for it. Rhett Oris spoke first. He said quietly that there were 60 children there. Then Martin's daughter spoke. She said her father would have let them in. Then Yerm Called spoke, and he spoke like an officer. He said that the 203 people were reinforcements, that Haigara could be arrested and put on trial, and that it was wrong to mix the 2 issues. Then voices rose from the crowd, repeating the same things, kind and righteous words. The people wanted to forgive. They needed to. For 23 days they had watched everything die, and they needed to see at least once that forgiveness works. Dalen looked at them and realized with complete clarity that if he said yes now, he would become, in their eyes, the one who restored normal order to the world. He climbed onto the back of the refrigerated truck so everyone could see him and spoke for 2 minutes. He said that all 203 people would be allowed inside. He said they would receive water, shelter, and food according to the general list starting tomorrow morning, and that the children would go to the hospital first today. He said that Ilsa Merv would work at the hospital, that she was a good doctor, and that he wouldn't send a good doctor to her death when there were only 2 doctors for 1,400 people. He said she would never receive the keys to a single door on this cliff. And then he spoke of Hagar Crane. He said Hagar would not be allowed in. He said there would be no trial, no arrest, and no execution. He said Hagar would receive 4 liters of water and food for 3 days and a place outside the perimeter, and that the gates were closed to him for life. Called said that was the same as killing him. Dalen answered him in front of everyone. He said they were different things and that Hagar would feel the difference. Then Hagar raised his head and asked just one thing. He asked, what for? Not for the warehouse. He said he would have taken the blame for the warehouse and wouldn't have argued. He asked what exactly the life sentence was for. And Dalen told him the one sentence he'd been preparing for 23 days and, until that very moment, hadn't known if he'd ever say. He said they don't give 30 for just one person. Hagar Crane looked up at him, and Dalen could see him trying to remember where he'd heard that before. He couldn't remember. He had never said that to anyone before. He got up from his knees, stood for a moment, then walked behind the line of containers, sat down on a rock, and stayed there until morning. 203 people passed through the gate one by one, right past him. The night that followed was the hardest of all 23 days. Dallin climbed onto the roof of the pump house and sat there until 3 o'clock when 3 people joined him. Corvin was the first to arrive, and he didn't say anything about Hagar. He said he'd reinforce the night shift with 2 extra guards and then left. Then Rhett came and said he disagreed, that he was staying anyway, and that he wanted Dallin to know that. Dallin said he understood. The third to climb up was Miv Tall. She sat down next to him and remained silent for about 20 minutes, then said that in that single night he had lost more than he had earned in a week at the tower. She said that people would forgive him for being harsh toward the enemy, but they would certainly not forgive him for being inaccurate. She said that he'd told Ilsa Merv about some first time that no one had actually witnessed, and that now there were 1,400 people on the hill, each thinking the same thing to themselves. Everyone was thinking that they too might already have had a first time that Dallin knew about. Dallin didn't answer her. He sat there, realizing that she was right and that this was the true price. At 4 in the morning, he went downstairs, walked along the wall, and reached the northern corner where the cliff dropped off. And there, on the concrete of the container, a circle had been drawn in chalk. There was nothing inside the circle. A woman was standing next to the circle. She stood calmly on the other side of the wall, right at the edge of the cliff, where one could only pass sideways. She held a piece of chalk in her hand. She was about 35 years old. She was short and very thin, dressed in a man's jacket that didn't belong to her, and her hair had been cut short with a knife. Dallin stopped 4 steps away. He asked who she was. She didn't answer that. She said he had 15 crystals and that it wasn't enough. She said it was a mistake not to have placed the one he'd taken from the shepherd, and that he hadn't placed it because he was afraid, and that he was right to be afraid. Dallin asked how she knew about the shepherd. She said she'd been watching from the ridge and had seen everything. Then she said the most important thing, and she said it calmly, almost matter-of-factly. She said that on the 28th day, it wouldn't just be troops entering the city. She said that dry dock number 3 would open a second time, and that the second breach would be twice as long as the first. She named the hour. She said he had 5 days. And then Dallin asked the only question that mattered. He asked her how many times she had seen this already. The woman looked at him and, for the first time during the entire conversation, raised her eyebrows slightly. She said 4. She said that the first time he died on the 41st day. The second time he made it through to winter. The third time he took the entire city and held it for 2 years. She said that the fourth time she'd seen him on the breakwater and that she'd been standing in the crowd outside the gates and couldn't get close. Then she said one last thing and walked away along the edge of the cliff, down into the darkness. She said that every time he dies on the same day and that there are fewer days left than he thinks. Dallin climbed over the container and followed her along the edge of the cliff, but couldn't catch up to her. The cliff dropped 40 meters, and she descended it in the dark as if she knew every ledge. He returned to the platform and woke up Corvin and Rhett, and at 6 in the morning, the 3 of them headed out to the port. He knew where to look for her. He headed for dry dock number 3. The dock's control room stood on stilts above the canal. It had a single door, and it wasn't locked. Inside, it was tidy. On the table lay a stack of wallpaper sheets, and grids had been drawn on them in pencil. Each square contained a date, and beneath the date was a note. A woman was sitting on the windowsill, warming her hands on a mug, and she wasn't surprised to see them. She said she'd been waiting for him yesterday. Her name was Nisa Wall. She'd been the dispatcher for this dry dock for 11 years. She told him everything in 40 minutes, speaking calmly and without a single attempt to surprise him. The first time she'd been here was on the 24th at 4:11 a.m. because she'd worked the night shift. She'd been standing 40 meters from the breach the moment it opened. It hadn't killed her. Something else entered her. She said it wasn't a crystal and that her body doesn't accept crystals at all. She'd tried twice and nearly died both times. She said all she was left with was the memory. She remembered every cycle in its entirety, from the first to the last day, and remembered them as clearly as last night. She said she couldn't change anything on her own. She said that over the course of 4 cycles, she'd tried to warn 109 people, and that 3 had listened to her, and that all 3 had died before their time. So she stopped talking and started drawing circles. Dallin asked about what she had said on the cliff. He asked about the day. She corrected him immediately. She said he had misunderstood her and that she had called it the Day of the Closed Door. She explained. In the first cycle, he died on the 41st day at the pumping station when 2 of his men closed the emergency hatch from the inside because the creatures were coming after him. In the second cycle, he made it to winter and died in a rail car at the marshalling yard, where they locked him out to feed him to whatever was pounding on the wall. In the third cycle, he took over the entire city and held it for 2 years and died at the gates of his own citadel because the gates were lowered 9 seconds before he could enter. In the fourth cycle, there was a breakwater. She didn't record that 4 times in a row he was killed by the same thing. Not the creatures, not hunger. The door that his own people closed in front of him. Dallin sat in silence, and it was very quiet inside his head. Then he asked her about the breach. Nisa spread her wallpaper sheets out on the table. She said that the gap was a door, and that the door operated on a schedule, and that the schedule was always the same. The first opening was at 4:11 a.m. on the 24th. The second was 28 days later and twice as long. The third one is another 28 days later and twice as long as the second. She said that in the first cycle, the city came to an end on the 56th day, and that the mainland held out until the third opening, and that after the fourth, there was nothing left worth talking about. She said that in all 4 cycles, no one closed the door. Dallin asked how it was closed. Nisa said she didn't know for sure. She said she knew 3 things, and that she'd learned all 3 from people who were dying right before her eyes. First, the door closes only from the inside. Second, the transparent crystal that fell out of the shepherd isn't a power, but a key, and it must be placed last and fully embedded. Third, every person has their own capacity, and for almost everyone, it's between 2 and 8. His is the largest she's seen in 4 cycles. 31. Dallin rolled up his sleeve and looked at the gray line. He asked if he'd ever reached 31 even once. She said that in the third cycle, he'd reached 29 over the course of 2 years, that it hadn't been enough, and that he didn't even know why he was collecting them. Then she said the most important thing about the third cycle, and she said it without any expression. She said that back then he had sealed off the city, stationed 3,000 people on the walls, didn't let a single one out, and kept it that way for 24 months. She said that the world outside had died completely during that time, and that then the third revelation came, and the walls were no longer needed. She said he was very good at everything except one thing. Not once in 4 cycles had he placed his life in the hands of others, and 4 times in a row he was killed by the hands of others on the door lever. Dallin stood up, walked over to the window, and looked down at the bottom of the dock. He asked her why she even followed him around with chalk if nothing could be changed. Nisa said that for the first time in 4 cycles, someone had 1,400 people alive and 15 crystals in hand by the 23rd day. She said that in the past, by that day, he had always been alone, or nearly alone. She said she didn't know if it would work out and that she simply had nowhere else to go. They walked back in silence. Corvin carried her sheets in a bag. At the gate, Dallin put her at the top of the supply list and gave her a spot in the control room next to the map without explaining anything to anyone. That evening, he gathered 6 people: Kalda, Sarna, Retta, Corvin, Miv, and Derva Kalta. He told them exactly what they needed to know and not a word more. He said that on the 28th, the dry dock would open for the second time, that the breach would be twice as long, and that the wave emanating from it would be twice as powerful. He said the door could be closed and that it would take 31 crystals in a single body to do so. He didn't mention that it had to be closed from the inside. He counted aloud in front of them. 15 were in his body, 12 in reserve, 1 transparent one. That made 28 in total. They'd need 3 more ordinary ones within 5 days. Miv Tal asked if he could handle 12 in a row. Dallin said he couldn't and that he'd administer 3 a day with breaks, and that there were now 240 ampules, which changed everything. Kald asked what would happen if he didn't make it in time. Dallin said that then, on the 28th, they'd hold the wall, and they'd hold it for a long time. Sarn said that he had 2 crystals in the elevator basement that he'd taken from looters, and that he was handing them over now. He sent someone to fetch them that very night. Only 1 remained. And then Nisa Val knocked on the door, came in, and said the last thing she remembered about that day. She said that during the 3rd rotation on the 28th, a column from the Eastern District Command entered the city. She named the hour. She said that the column entered the port from the southern entrance and stretched along the pier for a kilometer, and that a gap had opened up behind her. She said that not a single vehicle out of the 31 had made it out, and that after that, the Eastern Command ceased to exist as a force, and that the crossing held out for 9 days afterward without any personnel. Delenn picked up the radio from the table, turned it on, and called the Streletsky crossing. Colonel Vern Strock arrived in person the next morning, and he was furious. He said he had gone on the air at 4 in the morning to broadcast a message that sounded like nonsense, and that he was responsible for 4 cities and 8,000 people. Delenn told him that the convoy was not to enter the port on the 28th. Strock asked on what grounds. Delenn said he had no grounds, only knowledge. Then he did what he had already done twice before, and what had worked both times. He told the colonel a trivial detail. He said that today at 7:10 p.m. at the 7th pier of the river port, a pontoon beneath their fuel barge would burst, and that the barge had to be moved to the concrete wall by 6 p.m. Strock jotted this down in his notebook with a stony expression and left. The pontoon burst at 7:12 p.m. The barge was moored at the concrete wall, and at that moment 11 people were working on it, all of whom survived. Strock returned to Chalk Hill at midnight, entered without a guard, sat down across from Delenn, and remained silent for a very long time. Then he said that over the course of 11 days on the road, he'd gotten used to considering himself the senior figure in any room he entered. He said he had stopped thinking that way. He said he had reported to the council twice, and that both reports had been filed away, that the convoy was leaving on the evening of the 27th, that the route had been approved and signed off on, and that he was a colonel, not the council. He said he might be late. He said he might break down 2 vehicles on the road and lose a day, and that for that he would be relieved of command and court-martialed when the court-martial resumed. He said he would do it. He asked only one thing. He asked what exactly would be revealed in the dry dock. Delenn answered him honestly. He said he didn't know what was there and that he knew only the size and the time. 4 days passed, and they condensed into 3 images. The first, the 25th. The people of Sarn and 40 men from Kald are hauling containers to the dry dock and placing them in 2 rows from the edge of the dock to the water's edge, forming a corridor 300 meters long and 12 meters wide. Miv welds the joints and works 18 hours straight, taking breaks only to eat. She was the first to grasp the purpose of the corridor and said it aloud. You can't stop the wave. You can direct the wave. 300 meters of solid walls, and at the end, a channel 9 meters deep. Second, the 26th. The lower neighborhoods are moving upward. 800 people from the riverport and the interchange are marching toward Chalk Hill in a column along the road by the cliff, carrying everything they can carry. Noel Dries meets them with lists and registers each person in 4 minutes without making a single mistake. By evening, there are 2,200 people on the hill, 3 water distribution stations, and the line is organized by letter. Third, the 26th, at night. 8 dents stand in a row on the plaza in front of the pump station, and Corvin gives the command as a truck in first gear runs over them one by one. They're learning not to hit back. They're learning to stand, brace themselves, and fall correctly. Derv Kalt holds onto the bumper and is dragged by the rear across the concrete for 4 meters, but he doesn't let go. Delenn used to take 3 crystals a day. On the 24th, he took 3, and on the 3rd one, he stopped breathing for 1 minute and 40 seconds. On the 25th, he took 3, and on the 2nd one, blood started flowing from both his ears. On the 26th, he took 3, and after the 3rd one, he lay there for 6 hours, unable to speak, while Miv sat beside him, holding his hand and counting his pulse aloud. 27. 19 ampules were used up. There were 3 left to administer from the reserve, 2 from Sarn and 1 to find. Sarn brought his 2 on the evening of the 26th. 1. Ilsa Merv worked 16-hour shifts at the hospital, and 2 nurses from the riverport worked alongside her, yet she never once approached Dalen. On the 25th, when a staircase collapsed in the old wing, 3 people were buried under the rubble, and she was the first to climb in there herself before the debris was cleared away. She pulled out a little girl and kept her airways clear for 20 minutes in the darkness beneath the slab. Dalen learned about this from Miv. Miv told him that 203 of Hygar's people were living and working inside, that 20 of them were already on the general rosters for posts, and that people had stopped distinguishing between their own and outsiders. She said that he was the only one who hadn't stopped. Dalen replied that he didn't have time for that. She said that was his answer. Hygar Crane lived outside the perimeter on a rock at the northern corner. Water was brought to him every other day, and he took it. Over the course of 4 days, those who had been denied entry for various reasons joined him, more than 60 people in all, and they set up camp beneath the cliff, and Hygar held them off single-handedly, without a single gun. On the 26th, he relayed the first message to the top via the sentry. He reported that 4 vehicles had passed along the road from the junction, that the vehicles were heading toward the grain elevator, and that they bore Sarn's gray square emblem on their sides, which shouldn't have been there. Sarn checked and found that 3 of his men had left with weapons and fuel and had taken the vehicles. Hygar sent a second message that same night. He reported that a man named Barlow Sven was holding 90 people in a former furniture factory at the intersection, that Sven had 3 crystals, and that he wasn't selling them but trading them. Dalen went to see him on the morning of the 27th, accompanied by Corvin and Rhett, and unarmed. The furniture factory was surrounded by concrete blocks, and 6 men stood guard at the gate, all 6 of them well fed. Sven received him in the former cafeteria. He was just as small and neat as ever, wearing a clean shirt, and he was still tapping his fingernail on the table. He said he was glad to see the man who, 24 days ago, had walked away from him with a canvas bag full of money. He said he'd thought of him every day since the 24th. He said he now understood why the other man hadn't haggled. Dalen said he needed 3 crystals. Sven smiled and said he'd been offered the crystals for sale that very morning, that the buyer was in uniform, and that he'd offered a lot. He said the price was simple. He said he wanted 90 spots on Chalk Hill and wanted to be the one keeping the lists. Dallin said he'd get all 90 spots today, that Noel Dries kept the lists, and that Dries would continue to keep them. Sven said that in that case, there was nothing to discuss. Then Dallin made him the only offer he had left. He said that tomorrow at 4:11 a.m., the second door in the dry dock would open, and that the wave would be twice as big as the first one, and that the furniture factory stood in a straight line from the port to the interchange. He said that Sven's walls wouldn't stop it. He said he was taking 90 people right now, along with their leader, and that the leader inside would be one of the 2,300 and no one else. Sven stopped tapping his fingernail. He stared at Dallin for almost a minute. Then he said something Dallin hadn't expected to hear. He said that in this city, over the past 20 years, he'd seen two types of people: the first sell and the second buy, and that he understood both. He said the only type he didn't understand was the third. He said that 24 days ago, he'd given this guy money for an apartment and then sat by the window for 4 hours, thinking the guy was going to hang himself. He said he'd been wrong about exactly one thing. He'd thought the man knew his own end, but the man knew someone else's. Sven stood up, opened the safe, laid 3 crystals on the table, and didn't charge anything for them. He said 90 people would gather in an hour. They walked back in 2 columns, leading 90 people, and on the ascent to Dallin Hill, he fell behind and looked at the city from the last bend. The 27th. 18 hours until opening. Down below, 4 bonfires were smoldering, and people were walking up the bridge across the canal. 4 Mivtal lamps were burning above the pumping station. He placed the last 3 crystals that same night in the boiler room, where 6 people were sitting, and Miv was administering the drug on a countdown. On the 29th, he paused for 2 minutes, and they brought him back. On the 30th, he felt almost nothing, and that was scarier than anything else. He got up from the floor on his own and looked at his left forearm. The gray line was gone. There was just 1 dot left near his wrist, the size of a grain of rice. 30 out of 31. And at that moment, Corvin came down to the boiler room and said that Hagar Crane had come up from the port, passing both checkpoints, and that he was standing at the gate, and that he would speak only with Dallin, and that, according to him, he had absolutely no time to spare. Dallin stepped out behind the containers, and Hagar began speaking immediately, talking quickly. He said he'd been at the port that night because he goes down there every night to take planks from the docks. He said the convoy was already in the city. He said he'd seen it with his own eyes 2 hours ago at the southern entrance, that there were 31 vehicles, that they were lined up in a convoy on the waterfront with their headlights off, and that their leader wasn't Strack, but another man in uniform, accompanied by 2 officers. Dallin asked if they were stationary or moving. Hagar said they were stationary, waiting for dawn, and that they had stopped 300 meters from the southern entrance to the dry dock. Dallin glanced at his watch. It was 11:40 p.m. He roused everyone. Cald went downstairs with 20 men and a radio. Sarn took 3 vehicles out. Nisa Wall confirmed this and added something she hadn't mentioned before. She said that during the 3rd rotation, the convoy had also arrived ahead of schedule and stopped at exactly the same spot, and that the officers had received orders to occupy the port warehouses before dawn because there was food stored there. She said that no one had reached them at that time. Cald made it there. He walked out to the convoy at 1:20 a.m., stepping out into the open with his hands raised, and they forced him face down onto the asphalt, lifting him up only 20 minutes later. The senior officer was a lieutenant colonel named Darn. He listened to Cald for 4 minutes and said that he would report the breaches and the schedules up the chain of command, and that his men would occupy the warehouses by dawn as ordered. Cald told him that at 4:11 a.m., an 80-meter-long hole would open above the dock. Darn said that in 11 days he had seen 6 cities, and in each city there were 3 prophets. He ordered that Kald's weapon be returned to him and that he be escorted out. Kald transmitted a single word over the radio. Delane listened to it while standing on the roof of the pumping station, and at that moment he made a decision that he later called the only one for which he had enough time. He did not go to the convoy. He ordered that everything that could be moved to the port be moved to the southern entrance of the dock. He said that if the convoy could not be turned back, they would have to get between the convoy and the breach in time. There were 2 hours and 40 minutes left until 4:11. He gathered them in the dock control room and spoke for 4 minutes. 8 solids: Corvin, Derv Kalt, Miv Tal, Rhett Oris, Nisa, Kald with 20 arrows, Sarn with 18. He positioned everyone along the corridor of containers and explained the task in simple terms. No one fights to the death. Everyone holds the line and retreats to the canal at the whistle. The wave travels down the corridor and crashes into the water. The dense ones stand at the mouth of the corridor first and hold their ground for as long as they can. Then he pulled 3 of them aside and told them something he hadn't told anyone except Nisa. He told Rhett, Corvin, and Miv that he had already lived through this year once before. He told them about the breakwater, the 40 minutes leading up to it, the working sensor in the 3rd sector, the lever, and the light from the lantern in the crack beneath the gate. He spoke for 3 minutes without missing a beat. Corvin said nothing. He just sat down on a crate. Rhett asked who had been holding the lever. Delane gave a name. Rhett asked about the lantern. Delane didn't answer that. Miv Tal asked only one thing. She asked why he was saying this now. Delane said that the door locks from the inside, and that whoever goes to close it must know everything, and that if he doesn't come out, they need to know. Miv stood up and left the control room. She returned a minute later, sat back down in her seat, and asked no further questions. Nisa laid the last sheet of paper on the table. She said that her memory ended there and that, in the 3rd cycle at that time, he had been in an elevator 12 kilometers away and hadn't seen any of this. She said that from there on, he was going in blind, first among all 4 of them. At 3:05, Ilsa Merv arrived at the south entrance of the dock. She came with 4 stretchers, 2 nurses, and a box. She stood by the 2nd container and began setting up a first aid station. No one had called for her. Corvin looked at Delane. Delane looked at her across 100 meters of concrete, said not a word, turned away, and she stayed. At 3:40, Hygar Crane led 62 people from his camp under the cliff to the corridor. They came with crowbars, planks, and 2 axes. He stopped them 30 meters away, walked up alone, and said he wouldn't ask for anything more, that his men would stand where they were told, and that if Delane ordered them to leave, they would leave. Delane looked at these 62 men. Then he spoke the first sentence he had said to Hygar Crane in 28 days. Not as a verdict. He said that the 2nd row of the corridor was empty and that they had to hold it. Hygar nodded and led his men into the 2nd row. At 3:50, a column emerged toward the south entrance. 31 vehicles were driving with their headlights on along the embankment toward the warehouses, and the lead armored personnel carrier had already rounded the corner onto the dock. Kald was standing on a container, waving a flashlight. They had been spotted. No one stopped. And at 3:58, Colonel Vern Strack stepped out onto the road in front of the lead vehicle. He was late for his own delay. He had abandoned 2 broken-down vehicles and walked the last 9 kilometers with 18 men, stepping right in front of the convoy and standing in the glare of the headlights. Delane saw this from the roof of the container and heard over the radio as Darn yelled at Strack, and as Strack replied to him very quietly and very calmly. It was impossible to make out exactly what he was saying. The convoy stood still for 6 minutes. At 4:04, The lead armored personnel carrier began to turn around. At 4:09, the first 11 vehicles had turned around. Delenn glanced at his watch and realized that not everyone would make it in time, and that 20 vehicles were still trapped in the embankment pocket directly beneath the dry dock. He said one word to Cald over the radio. Cald began leading people away from the south entrance. At 4:11, the sky cracked over dry dock number 3. The streak shot up vertically, then spread out and stopped when it was over 80 meters long. It was the same color as wet asphalt, and it absorbed the light so that the headlights of the 20 cars beneath it turned yellow and dim, like candles. For 8 seconds, nothing happened. On the 9th second, it began to pour out. Delenn watched from the container and immediately started counting. In the first wave, about 3,000 emerged from the 40-meter-wide strip within the first hour. He multiplied that by 2 and realized that the corridor of containers wouldn't be able to withstand even half that number. And then he saw that it wasn't just the first wave emerging from the breach. Among the short, fast creatures scurrying across the concrete dock, something else was moving. It was twice as tall as a human, walked on all fours, and had no head where a head was supposed to be. There were 4 of them. They didn't run toward the people. They turned around and lined up along the edges of the breach, 2 on each side, and stood motionless. Nisaval climbed onto the container next to Dalen and looked at them, and he heard her stop breathing. He asked what they were. She said she didn't know. She said she hadn't seen them even once during the 4 laps. The wave reached the narrowest part of the corridor in 2 minutes. 8 dense ones stood at the narrowest part, with Corvin at the front. They held a 12-meter-wide line for 40 minutes, and during those 40 minutes, not a single creature passed through them. Dalen wasn't working at the bottleneck. He was working in the dock itself. He jumped off the ramp straight into the stream and walked against it toward the breach, doing exactly what he'd set out to do for 30 crystals. He was 3 times heavier than any of these creatures, and he didn't feel the impacts at all. He didn't strike them one by one. He moved through the crowd, pushing it aside with his shoulder, and they scattered from him like water. He did this so the crowd would flow into the corridor rather than spread out along the embankment toward the 20 cars. After 20 minutes, he realized he couldn't handle it. The crowd was too wide. Part of it veered right along the dock wall and spilled out onto the embankment, where shooting began. Dalen heard the gunfire and heard it grow heavier, and then heard screams mixed in with it. He didn't go there. He stood at the widest point, maintaining his position, knowing that Darn's men were paying the price for every minute he stood there on the embankment. By 5 in the morning, 11 of the 20 vehicles were on fire. Colonel Strack evacuated the people from there in 3 waves, bringing out about 100, and on the 3rd wave, he was pinned against the water at the 4th pier. Yerm Cald withdrew 20 gunmen from the corridor without orders and went there. He cleared a path along the waterfront and led more than 80 people, along with Lieutenant Colonel Darn, who had a shattered leg, and Strack himself, out to the containers. He did not return. He was found in the morning, 15 meters from the 4th pier. He was lying across the passage between 2 centers, and in the passage behind him lay so many creatures that it took 3 hours to clear them away. He held a 2-meter-wide passage and held it for exactly as long as it took for 80 people to pass by him. At 6 in the morning, the stream began to thin out. Miv Tall gave the signal, and 8 of the dense ones moved toward the canal at the whistle, and the corridor functioned exactly as she had intended. The creatures following behind ran into the solid walls and proceeded in a straight line for 300 meters, emptying into the 9-meter-deep canal. They drowned them there until 8 in the morning. At 8:15, the breach stopped releasing. It didn't close, it simply stopped. 4 headless creatures stood at its edges and didn't make a single move for 4 hours. Dallin left the dock at 8:30. There wasn't a single spot of clean fabric left on his clothes, and there wasn't a single wound on his body. He made his way up to the first aid station by the 2nd container. There, people lay in 4 rows on the concrete. Ilsa Merv was working on her knees, her head down, and he stood over her for 10 seconds without her noticing him. Rhett Oris brought him the list. 109 of their own killed, out of 2,300. About 240 of Darn's men. Of Hygar's 62 men in the second row, 31 were still alive. Colonel Strack approached him at 9 in the morning and said nothing about the council or the orders. He said only that Lieutenant Colonel Darn had received today everything a man needs to change his mind. He said that the crossing would give everything it had and that he personally would stand wherever Dallin told him to. Then he asked if it was over. Dallin looked at the hole in the sky above the dock and said that in 28 days it would open for the 3rd time and would be 160 meters long. He gathered everyone who was still on their feet in the control room at 10 in the morning. Nisa Wall was standing by the map. Dallin placed the shepherd's transparent crystal on the table. He said aloud what he had until then told only 3 people. He said that the door closes from the inside and that only a person with full capacity can enter, and that he had 30 out of 31, and that this one would be the last. Mivtal said that he was going there never to return. Dallin didn't lie to her. He said he didn't know how to get back out, and that none of the 4 loops knew, because no one had ever gone in. And then Nisa Val spoke up and said what she'd been waiting 28 days in this control room to say. She said she now understood why the 4 were there. She unfolded the sheet and showed her grids. She said that the door wasn't just a hole, that it had an edge, and that the edge was closing in. She said that in the first loop, she'd seen the gap above the dock close on its own 6 days after it first opened, that it took 31 seconds to close, and that the edges converged from both sides toward the center, cutting through everything that got caught in them. She said that 4 of them stand at the edges and keep it open, and that they are guards. She said that if they were removed, the door would start to close on its own. Dallin asked why anyone would even go inside then. Nisa said that closing wasn't the same as shutting. She said that the door would close and then reopen 28 days later, and it would be longer. She said that the key is inserted into the base from that side, and that after that, it would never open again. And she said one last thing. She said that if the guards were removed, whoever was inside would have 31 seconds. She said that in 31 seconds, it was possible to go in, insert the key, and return, and that a person of full stature would have enough time. She said that the edge would cut into you in the process, and that only force could keep you from being pulled inside. Dallin sat there and counted. 31 seconds. 20 meters in. 20 back. The key into the base. And the door that converges toward the center, and that must be held from the outside with your hands while it moves back. He raised his head and looked at them. At Corvin, whose left arm was broken and whom he was holding to his chest. At Derv Kalt. At Miv Tal. At Rhett. At Strack. At Sarn. And he realized with complete clarity that for the first time in 5 lifetimes, he would have to walk through the door and ask strangers to hold it open. Nisa Val was looking at him, and he could see that she had realized this a second before he did. He said aloud that the 4 guards had to be taken out simultaneously, that only the dense ones could do it, and that it would take all 8 of them. He said that those who remained would hold the door open. He said he was going out tonight because in 28 days it would be 160 meters, and there would be no second chance. No one objected. Mivtal asked what would happen to him if he didn't make it out in time. Dallin said he didn't know. Nisa said she knew. She said that then everything would start over on the 24th, and that she'd be sitting in this control room again, drawing circles, and that this would be the 6th time. Dallin went outside and stood alone for about 5 minutes. Then he went down to the first aid station and approached Hygar Crane, who was sitting on the concrete by the wall among his 31 men. He told him that they would be manning the guard post that night, that they needed extra hands, and that anyone who volunteered could stay there. Hygar stood up. He asked only how many people were needed. Dallin said they needed everyone. And at 11 p.m. on the 28th, they all gathered at dry dock number 3. 2,100 people stood along the edge of the dock, on the ramps, and on the containers, and remained silent. 8 thick ones went down to the breach and split up, assigning 2 to each guard. Dallin took off his jacket and rolled up his left sleeve, and Mivtal cut open his forearm at the spot where the last dot remained. He took the transparent crystal between 2 fingers, looked at it one last time, and placed it into the incision. The transparent crystal didn't cause a spasm, it caused a chill. Dallin felt the chill travel from his wrist up his arm, across his shoulder to his chest, and stop somewhere behind his sternum, where it remained. He opened his eyes and found that he was seeing the gap differently. He now saw it not as a strip in the sky, but as a structure with a top and a bottom and a foundation extending deep into the concrete of the dock. He saw a point at the base of this structure. The point was 22 meters inside and 1.5 meters above the floor, and he knew it as well as he knew his own pocket. He stood up. Mivtal asked if he was ready. He said he was ready. Everything else had been planned out, and nothing went according to plan. 8 dense ones lined up in pairs next to each guard. Corvin gave orders with one hand. Derv-Kult worked in tandem with Sarn's man. On command, they struck simultaneously, and within the first 4 seconds, it became clear that the guards weren't fighters. They didn't know how to fight at all. They were built for one thing: to hold their ground. 3 of them were taken out in 9 seconds. The 4th, on the left flank, wouldn't budge. He was clinging to the edge of the breach so tightly that he couldn't be pried loose, and Derv-Kult struck him with the crowbar 11 times. On the 12th strike, he thrust the crowbar beneath the point where the lines met, pressed down with all his weight, and tore him down along with a chunk of concrete. Derv-Kult remained lying 3 meters from the breach and did not get up. The opening closed immediately. Delenn saw this with his new eyes, and he saw the speed. 80 meters began to converge toward the center from both sides. He ran inside. Inside, there was nothing resembling a room. There was light that didn't illuminate, a floor that couldn't be seen, and air that hung in his lungs like water. He covered 22 meters in 9 seconds and saw the base. It looked like a root extending downward, and it was warm. He inserted the key into the slot and pressed down with his palm, and the key sank all the way in, and in that instant, everything left him. He later described it the same way, always using the same words. He said that 31 things were pulled out of him at once. He felt the density leaving his body. He felt the weight of his own hands. He felt the cold of the concrete through the soles of his feet and felt the pain in the rib he'd broken 4 days earlier, which he'd forgotten about. In 2 seconds, he became once again the man who, 28 days earlier, had been working as a crane operator at the lower pier. It was 22 meters to the gate, and there were 14 seconds left before it closed. He ran back, running now like an ordinary person, but he couldn't make it in time. The gap had narrowed to 8 meters when he was 15 meters away, to 4 meters when he was 7, and at that moment, hands reached into the opening from the other side. Corvin was the first to step into the gap, bracing his back against one edge and his feet against the other, and it began to close in on him. A man from Sarna stood next to him, then 2 more. They couldn't hold it up with their own strength, and they didn't. What held it up was the fact that behind them, along the entire length of the container corridor, stood 2,100 people, with those in front pressing against the backs of those in front of them, and the entire mass pushing forward. A piece of scrap metal was pushed into the opening, and 4 hands rested on it. Then a second piece of scrap. Then the body of a refrigerated truck, which 18 men from Sarna pushed across the concrete and rammed into the opening with its end. The opening was cutting through. It cut like a pair of shears, severing the arm of a man from the river port up to the elbow and taking the leg of one of Darn's men. Higer Crane stood right in the middle of the opening, holding the top edge with his shoulder and both hands, and when the body of the truck entered the opening, he found himself trapped between the truck and the edge. He didn't come out of there. He held that top edge for 6 seconds, and during those 6 seconds, Dalen traveled the last 7 meters and tumbled out through a 1.5-meter gap, landing on the concrete of the dock. He raised his head. Higer Crane was looking down at him from 2 steps away, saying something that was impossible to make out. Then the hatch slid across the hull and over him. The gap closed with a dry click. Above dry dock number 3 was the usual night sky. Dalen lay on the concrete, unable to stand, and was lifted by Rhett Oris and one of Strack's men. He hung on their shoulders and weighed as much as an ordinary man. Of the 8 Fick ones, 2 were killed, Derv Kalt and a guy from the riverport named Oin. 9 more people died in the blast, and 11 were left maimed. Higer Crane was pulled from under the hull that morning. Dalen stood nearby the whole time while they were pulling him out, and wouldn't let anyone else take his place. A day later, he was buried on the cliff behind the pumping station, next to Hesk Marden's grave, and everyone attended the funeral. 3 people spoke. Dalen was the last to approach. He didn't speak in front of others. He waited until everyone had left and remained alone by the stone, sitting there until dark. He told the dead man about the breakwater. He told him everything, about the working sensor, the 40 minutes, the lever under his palm, and the light from the lantern in the crevice. He said he'd kept it to himself for 28 days, and that now he was confiding it to him alone because there was no one else to tell. He said that in that life, this man had weighed 30 against 1. He said that in this one, he'd weighed 6 seconds against 1 and had weighed it the other way. He said this wasn't forgiveness and that there would be no forgiveness. He said that this was a reckoning and that the reckoning was over. Then he stood up and went downstairs and never climbed back up onto the rock again. Nisa Val left on the 4th day. She went to the control room, gathered her wallpaper sheets into a bag, burned them in the courtyard, and stood over the fire until it had burned out. Delen asked where she was going. She said that in her first cycle she had a sister at the Streletsky crossing, and that for 4 cycles in a row she had known her sister would die on the 19th day, but that in this cycle, the 19th day had passed and nothing had happened. She said that for the first time in 5 lifetimes, she didn't know what tomorrow would bring, and that she wanted to see. At the gate, she stopped and told him one last thing. She said that the day of the closed door hadn't come. She said she'd counted it 4 times and was wrong on the 5th, and that it was the best thing that had ever happened to her. Delen asked if she would return. Nisa Wall said no and walked down the road along the cliff, and he watched her go until she turned the corner. Ilsa Merv came to him herself a week later. She came into the control room, stood by the door, and said she was leaving with Strack's people for the crossing and that she had only one request. She asked him to tell her about the first time. She said she hadn't slept for 28 nights because of it, and that she hadn't found it anywhere in her life. Delen sat at the table with the lists, looking at her, and realized that he now had not a single crystal left, that he was the weakest person on this rock, and that there was nothing left to fear at all. He told her. He told her about the 412th day, the northern breakwater, and the 4th wave. He told her that she herself had sent him to the outer line 40 minutes before it all began, and that the sensor in the 3rd sector had been working properly. He told her that she had been standing by the slit under the gate with his bag in her hands, and that the lantern in that slit hadn't moved until the very end. Ilsa Merv listened while standing. She didn't sit down. When he finished, she was silent for a very long time. Then she said she wouldn't claim it wasn't her. She said that in the past 28 days, she had already opened the door for him once at night and therefore knew everything there was to know about herself. She said she wouldn't ask for forgiveness because there was nothing to ask him for. That wavebreaker is gone. She said she simply wanted to know what to fear within herself. She turned to leave, and then Dalen took the key to the lower door of the collector off the wall, placed it on the table, and slid it toward her. He said that the hospital was still hers and that someone else should go to the crossing. He said that the lower door had always been hers and that he'd kept it for 28 days by mistake. Ilse Merv took the key and left, and that very day she returned to work and worked at Chalk Hill for 11 years. Winter came on the 41st day. Dalen remembered that day from the first cycle, and he went about it like any other. He worked. He no longer had any crystals, and none ever appeared again because the container had burned up along with the key, and Miv Tall had checked this twice, and he took it in stride more calmly than she did. He hauled boxes with someone else and was exhausted by evening. He slept 8 hours a night, and in the 4th month, Rhett Oris told him to his face that he had become unbearably slow. By spring, 4,600 people lived on Chalk Hill. The well was holding up. Vale Sarn was in charge of the machinery and the metal. Noel Dries managed the warehouses and ran them better than anyone else. Miv Tall pieced together a power line for 20 houses from 3 dead generators. Corvin commanded 6 outposts, and his left arm never fully straightened out again. Hesk Martin's daughter managed the water distribution, and by spring, her son had started attending the school that had been opened in the former boiler room. Colonel Vern Strack merged the crossing and the hill into a single district and asked Dalen to join the council for a second term. Dalen agreed and, at the very first meeting, raised the only issue on the agenda. He raised the issue of the list. A list of everyone living on Chalk Hill hung on the wall by the gate. It had been there since the 18th, and Rhett Oris had been keeping it. Dalen Wurst's name was at the top of the list. He asked that his name be removed from there and placed in the general alphabetical order. The council debated for 40 minutes. He explained it to them once, briefly. He said that the person at the top of the list eventually decides that he is more important than the list itself. He said he had seen it happen. He said he had seen it 5 times, and that 4 times the person had been killed by his own people for it, and that once he himself had been that person. The list was rewritten that very evening. Dalen Vorst took his place on the list between a woman named Vorn and an old man named Vierk. He lived on that rock for another 41 years and died in his bed that winter at the age of 67. And on that day, 11 people sat at his door, and the door was open.